The following compilation features unsettling and spine-chilling tales sourced from Reddit's horror communities. Reader discretion is strongly advised. These narratives may contain graphic descriptions, psychological distress, and themes that could unsettle sensitive individuals. Proceed with caution, as immersion into these eerie stories may provoke fear, unease, and sleep disturbances. Enter this realm of Reddit's creepy horror stories at your own risk, as the line between reality and the macabre may blur within these chilling narratives. Story 1. Every boyfriend I get is brutally dying. Now I know the truth about them, and me. It's me, Brianna, not you. That's what my latest boyfriend told me before walking directly into the path of a truck. There was barely anything of him, just enough to peel off of the sidewalk. I thought our relationship was going well. It's not like I'm desensitized to my boyfriends dying or ceasing to exist, but it's almost become the norm. Ben was my first boyfriend in high school, and my longest relationship to date. Fluffy-haired Ben with his dimpled grin and freckles. He was the type of guy who should have been popular, but chose to keep to himself. I met him in the principal's office. Ben was being lectured for sneaking around, and I was handing in a late assignment. All he did was wink at me, and I fell. Hard. We dated for 2 years, and I really thought he was the one. Ben told me he loved me, and every Friday he introduced me to a new restaurant. I was in love. I loved everything about him. On the night before our senior prom, a drunk driver T-boned my boyfriend's car, killing him instantly. After his funeral, it's like he stopped existing. His parents left town, and every time I mentioned him, my parents would slowly tilt their heads and act confused when I brought him up. My brother was the worst for it, considering he and Ben were best friends. But he just looked at me with this weird fucking look in his eye, like his soul had been ripped out. Eyes are the windows to the soul, apparently, and my brother's soul was MIA. Ben, his expression crumpled. Wait, who? Alex was my emotional support, who later became someone closer. Funny Alex. Blonde but not quite blonde. Alex. I met him in group therapy. My boyfriend was dead, and he had just lost his mother. We didn't label it, because he had a girlfriend, and I didn't want to move on so quickly. I think we just found comfort in each other. Eventually, though, Alex became something I wanted to label. His sense of humor was a breath of fresh air. I didn't go to college because of Ben's death. Settling for a mediocre barista stop in town, Alex came in every day with fresh coffee and a sugar cookie. I think I loved him. I told him that, half asleep. I told him I wanted to try and be something more with him. Alex looked taken aback, but happy. We spent the night together. The morning after, I woke to my mother screaming. Alex was dead in the bathroom, his blood splattering, staining pristine white. According to the first responders, he died of a self-inflicted head injury. The exact same thing followed. I attended his funeral, and Alex's family disappeared. This time, I went back to his house, but according to a neighbor, his house had been abandoned for 10 years. I had eaten pancakes in his kitchen just days earlier. I broke in to see myself, but my neighbor was right. The hallway was piled with ancient mail and threats of eviction. Alex's room didn't exist. Instead, a storage room filled with boxes. When I got home, my family had already forgotten Alex's existence. The town had forgotten him, and yet his blood still stained my bathroom. Following Alex's death, I was terrified of getting too close to people. But Esme made it hard. She was my third relationship. We met at a bar. I was extremely drunk and convinced I was cursed to kill all of my romantic partners. Esme. Cute Esme. Crooked teeth and smudged lipstick and warm Esme. Do you know that person you meet and you instantly connect with them? The person you're sure is your soulmate? That was Esme. I told myself I wouldn't get close to her, but I was already talking to this girl, already pouring my life out to her. Esme sat and listened, her chin resting on her fist. She was a first-year creative writing student, and she had a cat called Peanut. I didn't remember much after that. We hit it off, and next thing I know, we're curled up in the back of her car watching Buffy on her iPad. I told her about my exes, and she nodded and smiled, but I don't think she was listening. I told her all of my exes have died, and then been erased from existence. Esme called me cute. She wanted to base a story around the concept, sitting up and grabbing her phone. I have this memory of the girl I fell in love with at first sight. She's nodding along to a Smiths song spluttering from my car radio, typing on her phone. I can hear the tapping of her nails, her lips curving into a smile. I can see the exact moment she gets inspiration, pulling her knees to her chest. She's wearing fishnet tights that are torn, and a jacket that doesn't fit her. She is fucking beautiful, and I don't want to lose her. Alex was beautiful. He had pretty eyes and brown curls that I liked running my hands through. Ben was beautiful. He made my heart swim, my stomach swarm with butterflies. When I first met him, Ben was my first love. The realization woke me up one night, 3 months into dating Esme. Both of them were dead, wiped away like they never existed. And Esme would follow. At first, I tried to break it off with her without sounding crazy. I told her it was me, not her, and I wasn't in the mindset for a relationship. Esme understood, but her eyes didn't. I didn't want to lose her. Esme lit up every room she entered. Her obsession with thrifted clothes and badly written poems, and her irrational fear of pandas, made her someone I wanted to be with. So, I stayed with her. I told myself Ben and Alex were just coincidences that were nothing to do with me, and I wasn't indirectly fucking killing the people I fell in love with. I avoided the L word for as long as I could. It slipped out on my way to work. Esme was driving. I just said it, and her eyes lit up. She reached out and squeezed my hand. At work, one of my colleagues, Jasper, caught my eye. When I twisted around to ask him to grab something, I glimpsed his phone screen. It looked like Tinder, though I didn't recognize the layout. It reminded me of Twitter. In dark mode, Jasper was leaning against the counter, his thumb hovering over a photo of Esme, chewing his bottom lip. I watched his thumb prance across the screen before he gave up and swiped left. Finishing up the woman's coffee, I handed it over. I asked for cream. Ignoring her, I sidled in front of my colleague, hyper-focused on whatever app he was playing around with. What's that? Jasper looked up, his eyes widening, lips parting, like a fucking goldfish. Clearly nothing. Jasper sidestepped me, opening the refrigerator and pulling out milk. But he already had milk. The bastard was stalling. We had 0 customers waiting, so it was the 2 of us, and a long, dragged-out pause. Jumping up and down on the heels of his feet, he shot me his usual grin, slipping his phone in his apron. Jasper may have been smiling, though there was something twisted in his expression. I couldn't stop myself. Was that a dating app? Dating app? Excuse me, can I get what I ordered? The woman demanded, waving her coffee in the air. I asked for whipped cream. Jasper saw that as an excuse, an escape, and nodded, fashioning a grin. He saw an opportunity and took it, of course.
Ma'am!
I'll get that for you, he said, with a little too much sarcasm. The boy took her coffee with a spring in his step, ducking in the refrigerator for the whipping cream. Jasper added too much whipping cream, dumping the drink on the counter with a little too much force. It was a good thing my colleague was marginally attractive guy with cropped blonde hair and a deadpan voice that somehow attracted the ladies. Jasper could insult someone directly to their face, and they would just blush and get all tongue-tied. I had seen it happen in real time. A girl was flirting with him and used a bad pickup line, which was something along the lines of, "Did it hurt when you fell from heaven?" He laughed, and her eyes brightened. She giggled along with him, nudging her friends. But he wasn't laughing with her. I saw the gleam in his eye. He was laughing at her. Still laughing, Jasper plonked her milk latte down so hard half of it spewed out. And, with that exact same charming smile, he deadpanned, "Did it hurt when you dropped out of a drain pipe?" Yeah, my colleague was blessed with good looks. Otherwise, he would have been punched in the face by now. Presently, he was being his usual asshole self. "Is there anything else I can get you?" The woman shook her head, pulling a face. Jasper had, essentially, ruined her drink. It was more cream than coffee. When she left the store, I situated myself in front of him when he was counting cash. "What were you just looking at?" I nodded to the guy's phone sticking out of his pocket. "Was it like a dating thing you were on?" Jasper didn't even look at me, his lip curling. "That's kinda rude." He hummed, "I don't peek at your phone." Esme Hope was all I could hiss out. Was she on that dating app? My colleague proceeded to stare at me like I'd grown a second head. Before his half-lidded gaze flicked behind me, Jasper's expression brightened. "Oh, Hannah is calling me," he said, choking out a laugh. Hannah was not calling him. She was in the break room getting high. Jasper slowly backed away, maintaining his smile. "I'll be back in a sec." "All right." He grabbed that same carton of milk with a grin. "Don't you just love when your milk stays fresh?" "What?" "Fresh milk," he grinned. "Mulberry Farm's finest." Jasper was darting away before I could coerce a sentence. After work, I texted Esme as usual. She was my ride on Fridays. Esme didn't reply. I texted her again, a little more panicked. "Hey, are you okay?" When I called her, an automated voice told me she wasn't available. Already feeling sick to my stomach, I drove to her place myself. I could see the flashing lights before anything else, blurred red and blue, sending my thoughts into a whirlwind. It took me 10 minutes to muster the courage to jump out of my car and ask a pale-looking deputy what was going on. I tried to jump over the yellow tape, only to be politely pulled back. "Carbon monoxide poisoning," the deputy told me. "The whole family is dead." He sighed. "Mom, Dad, and their daughter in college." I think he was trying to be sympathetic, awkwardly patting me, but I was already on my knees, all of the breath dragged from my lungs. Luckily, it's just like going to sleep. Monoxide is a silent killer. Monoxide is a silent killer. Was that the same as... I'm sorry. Ben was in the wrong place at the wrong time. And Alex was silently suffering. He did what he thought was best. I didn't go to Esme's funeral. Mom and Dad and Will had already forgotten her, just like the others. What I did do, several days later, when her name wasn't even a memory anymore, I bought flowers from the store. Roses were Esme's favorite. The seller was around my mom's age, a plump-looking woman wearing a floral dress, long red hair tied into a ponytail. She was on her phone, humming to a tune on the radio. The Smiths. "I hope she likes them," the woman said, wrapping the flowers in red ribbons. She had a strong southern accent that immediately annoyed me. I took the roses, stuffing them in my bag. "What did you say?" The seller cocked her head. "Hmm? How did you know they were for my girlfriend?" The woman sighed, placing her phone on the counter. I glanced at whatever she'd been so interested in, but the screen was face down. Esme came in here a lot. Her lips broke out into a sad, sympathetic smile. I was quickly growing sick of them. "Esme, she told me you guys were dating." Esme was always buying roses for her room. Sometimes she would stand in here for hours and just stare at flowers. I think she found comfort in them. The woman sighed, fixing me with what I could only describe as a pitiful pout. "Ugh! I hope you can find the same comfort," she murmured. The seller handed me an extra rose, and I found myself reaching out for it, my eyes stinging. Fuck. I hadn't cracked in at least 15 hours, and that was a record, but now I could feel myself splintering, tears trickling down my cheeks. The flower lady squeezed my hand. "I'm sorry. Sweetheart, if it makes you feel better, it's just like going to sleep. Monoxide is a silent killer. Her words were familiar. Exactly what the deputy said. Before I could speak, she dumped weed killer on the counter. Did you know our plant killer is $10.99? Her sudden bout of energy took me off guard. I tried to smile. I don't want any plant killer. The seller nodded, handing me another rose. Oh, of course, darling, but it is $5.99, just for today. Something pricked me, and I hissed out, wafting my hand. Damn thorns. I could already see a single spot of blood. I nodded, sucking my teeth against a cry. Thanks, but I'll skip it this time. I took the roses to what used to be Esme's grave. Now, it was an empty headstone with no name, no memories, no flowers, nothing. Just like Alex and Ben, Esme had been reduced to dirt under my feet. I stayed at her grave for a long time, long enough for the sky to grow dark, and my thoughts darker. I tried to find a logical explanation for the sudden deaths of the people I got close to, but all I could think of was a curse. So, I started Googling curses, leaning against Esme's headstone, my knees to my chest. Had I been cursed? Was my family cursed? According to Google, a cursed object connected with the curse itself, which could be anything, though I didn't remember visiting any ancient ruins or an old church. With zero answers, I headed home. I passed a guy playing the Smiths in his car, then a group of older women wearing ripped fishnets. Esme was following me, just like Alex's smell, fresh coffee and rich chocolate. Ben's cologne filled my car last summer. His favorite band was playing all day on our local music station. I drove around with no destination, listening to each one on repeat, until I was losing him all over again. The sweet aroma of flowers followed me all the way home, and I was tipsy on the smell when I found myself face to face with a boy, under the overexposed streetlight. This guy was almost ethereal, thick brown hair and freckles. He reminded me of Ben, which wasn't fair. I thought I was hallucinating him. Before he came closer, bleeding from the shadow, I saw more of him, white strips of something wrapped around his head. Wrong. The words slammed into me when I glimpsed his clothes. Filthy. The guy was wearing a white button-down, a single streak of bright red ingrained into the material. His white pants were torn, glued to his legs. He was barefoot, the soles of his feet slapping on wet concrete. I didn't realize he was in front of me, nose to nose, until he shoved me hard. Josie. His voice was a whimper. Despite his narrowed eyes, his lips twisted into a scowl. He was crying, and had been crying, every heaving sun sputtering from his mouth. The boy shoved me again, and I staggered. His ice-cold breath grazed my cheeks. What the fuck did you do to my sister? Sister? I whispered. Something wet landed on my cheek. Suddenly, rain. I wasn't expecting a downpour. The weather was forecasted to be clear. To my surprise, the guy let out a harsh-sounding laugh. The two of us were slowly getting drenched, but neither of us were making a move to get out of the rain. My hair was glued to the back of my neck, my clothes sticking to me. But somehow, I wanted to stay in the rain. It was refreshing. When a thought hit me, telling me to get out of the rain, it was shoved to the back of my mind. The guy spat water out of his mouth, shaking his head like a dog. Of course, he muttered. Drown me out with the rain. I found my voice, my gaze glued to intense red seeping through the bandage stapled to his head. He looked like he'd escaped an emergency room. I don't know anyone called Josie. I said, I think you've got the wrong person. The guy's eyes narrowed. He stepped closer, grabbing my shoulders, and I noticed how hollow his eyes were, empty caverns carved into his skull. Eyes are the windows to the soul, and this guy was completely soulless. I'm only going to say this once, he whispered. What did you do to my sister? Before I could respond, the guy was being violently grabbed and dragged back. Figures who appeared seemingly out of nowhere. Let me go, he cried out. struggling. "You fucking assholes. Let me go!" His screaming became muffling when his cries were gagged. "You promised," he yelled, his cries collapsing into a sob. "You said if you took me, she wouldn't get hurt. So, where is she?" He met my gaze, his expression crumpling, something inside him coming apart, splintering by the seams. "You can't take both of us." This wasn't in the agreement. When he was dragged further back, I noticed a car parked at the side of the road. The boy was pulled inside. At first, he refused, before an extra pair of hands shoved him. "You fucking I heard his fists slamming into the windows. "Don't take me back there. Please, just let Josie." His cries once again collapsed into angry, muffled screaming, and I felt my hands moving towards my pocket for my phone. This was a kidnapping, right? I was witnessing a kidnapping in broad fucking daylight. A shadow was suddenly in front of me, and I jumped, tearing my eyes from the car. Jasper, my colleague, he was still wearing his apron, and to my confusion, was swinging a carton of whole milk. "Sorry, Bree," he winked, speaking in a single breath. "As you can see, our friend here had a little too much to drink." I nodded, craning my neck. Jasper stepped in front of me, maintaining a grin. "Who is he?" This time, I sidestepped away from him, only for him to copy. "Just a guy," he said. "As you can see, he's a little..." Jasper prodded his right temple. "Let's just say he's got a few too many screws loose." Jasper laughed, staying stock still, blocking my way. When I made a move to counter him, he stepped in front of me, his eyes hardening. "I heard he lost his family a while ago in a..." He pretended to think. "Oh, yeah, a car crash. Maybe a gas explosion. I'm not really sure." I could hear the car behind him, and once again I tried to dart past him, but he was quick to block my way. He was getting closer to me, very subtly backing me in the opposite direction. Anyway, this guy is kind of nuts. Dude still thinks he's got a sister. When I lost patience and shoved him out of the way, the car and the guy was gone. "See?" Jasper rolled his eyes. He was still holding milk from work. My head spun. It was 8 p.m. We were in a suburban neighborhood, and Jasper was holding half a pint of milk. His apron was stained with coffee, and when I really looked at him, I realized he was out of breath. He was doing a good job of hiding it, exhaling in intervals, swiping at his forehead to clear sweat. When I noticed, he pretended to run his hands through his hair. I feel for him. Like, I'm sorry his family died, or whatever, but attacking random girls isn't cool, you know." Instead of replying, I stumbled home. It was sunny, at 8 p.m., and when I took notice, I wasn't even wet. Esme was my last straw. I made a promise to myself to not get close to anyone. The guys and girls I met were friends, and nothing more. Weirdly enough, the only guy I was getting close to was my colleague. I don't know if it was brain damage, or I was finally losing the plot, but Jasper's shameless cruelty towards customers, and that quirk in his lips when he made them cry, was kind of hot. However, he was playing hard to get, and I mean really playing. I was in storage trying to find vegan milk, and he was suddenly a fucking expert, spewing milk facts. When I slammed the refrigerator door shut, he was inches from my face. In the dim light from a single spluttering bulb, his eyes reminded me of coffee grounds. I thought maybe he was going to kiss me, judging from his softening expression. I waited for the guy to wake up, but I don't even think he was alive. He stood, unblinking, letting this thing twist and contort his face. And it was then when I realized these things weren't even human. I could see the mechanics built under their flesh, both living tissue and metal melded together. Brianna's father, who is a little on the crazy side, with too much cash and not enough logic, took his daughter's rejection a little too personally. Sam continued. So he promised his daughter he would find her the perfect match. I started to speak, the words coming out before I could stop them. My father would never... I didn't say it was your father, Sam said. His eyes darkened. Anyway, as I was saying, the townspeople became unhealthily obsessed with who Brianna would choose. So obsessed, in fact, that the girl's day-to-day life was broadcasted across town, while her potential love interests were ranked week after week. First there was Ben. Sam's smile thinned. Her high school boyfriend. Sam shrugged. She grew bored of him. Also, he kind of did something unforgivable. He continued. Then, Alex. She liked him, but sometimes he was a little too unserious. The guy was a clown. I backed away, but he was quick to grab my shoulders. Finally, Esme, who she truly fell for. I swallowed. Esme is... He cut me off. But I didn't mention that they hurt her, did I? Sam leaned against the bar. Behind him, I could see a figure in white pushing a gurney with a Ben strapped to it. Ben tried to rape her, insisting she wanted it. Alex dumped her on her birthday. Esme ended their relationship with a one-word text. Goodbye. Sam mimed an explosion. That was the nail in the coffin. I caught blood sliding down his nose. You're still bleeding. Sam gingerly prodded his nose. Yeah, it's an effect of the severing. I've been in the red zone too long. I should probably speed this up. He talked faster, his voice collapsing into a mumbled slur. Brianna couldn't take it. Her best friend was ignoring her. Everyone she had fallen in love with hurt her. Esme wasn't returning her calls. Ben was sleeping around right in front of her, and Alex was still being a clown. Brianna's poor parents found her hanging from her bedroom ceiling fan. I shook my head, my thoughts screaming, "No." He held a finger up to shush me. "Let me talk. Jeez." Sam folded his arms. A grieving father would do anything to avenge his dead child, Bert. Mr. Timberman took finding a perfect match, and the show must go on a little bit too literally. His sickly smile found me, which also means going stark fucking crazy. The town wanted more of Brianna and her life, so he turned his daughter's failed love life into a town-wide TV show, sending the entire teen and young adult populace into here. He gestured around him, to make the perfect suitors, who wouldn't hurt his new Brianna. Something ice-cold crept down my spine. He cleared his throat. Mr. Timberman grew, let's say, obsessed with getting revenge on these specific 4 people, so he started killing them. He coughed. Sorry, us. Killing us for the funny haha. Look at how many times I can fuck with them. Bit. And then recycling us into someone completely different. Our names are gone. Then our personalities. Finally, our bodies ripped to pieces and sculpted into Brianna's exes. Sam poked me in the cheek. The cycle continues. They reset your ticker and the town eats it up. They can bring back Esme, Ben and Alex whenever they want and add curveballs. Like the bad boy colleague who becomes the fan favorite. Sam's lips curved. For some fucking reason. His eyes flickered open. However, Brianna will never find a suitor because her father is a fucking sociopath. To him and the town, his dead daughter's pathetic love life is entertainment. He held out his arm. See? I tried really hard not to look through the makeup, at noticeable skin grafts. I was a Ben, he said. Then I was an Alex, and then I was an extra. His eyes found mine, sad suddenly. But who I was, originally, is kinda gone. All I remember is a deal to protect Josie. I gave myself up so they wouldn't take her. Your sister, I said. Sam nodded. His earlier words hit me. He was talking like Brianna Timberman was dead. But I was Brianna Timberman. I was rejected by Sam, yes, but I found Ben. As if he could read my mind, Sam shook his head. Look at yourself, he said, his voice shaking. And I mean really look at yourself. Sam stepped closer. Because underneath all of that makeup and the prosthetics and surgery and fucked up memories, you're just another recycled lump of flesh. He prodded my temple. Who thinks she is Brianna Timberman? His voice was slurring again, a fresh stream of scarlet seeping down his chin. Don't you want to know? His eyes rolled to pearly whites. Before he could finish his sentence, Sam dropped to the ground. I remember warm arms grasping hold of me, shadows with no faces. They pricked me twice in the back of my neck. A familiar voice in my ear, almost a hiss. Jasper, you are the worst fucking Brianna. When I came to, I was standing up somehow, at work. I am Brianna Timberman. The thought floated around in my head, my memory hazy. Hello? A man was waving his hands in front of me. I asked for iced coffee, lady. Jasper was serving another customer. Bree, wake the fuck up. They were trying to make me think I was hallucinating, which was crazy, because my fingernails were still tinted with Sam's blood. The marks he'd left on my wrist when he was yanking me were still there, bruised on my arm. Bree, Jasper snapped. Snap out of it and make the dude his drink. Right. The word slipped out of my mouth. He caught my eye, winking, and Brianna Timberman internally squeaked. I half wondered what he was. Was he recycled or an unwilling performer? Throughout the day, I was fully aware my words were not mine, like I was on autopilot. But not just that. My thoughts weren't mine either. I spent half of my shift staring at my colleague's biceps. During my break, I went into the bathroom and stood in front of the mirror. I am Brianna Timberman, but even when I told myself that, my eyes were too blue. My smile was too perfect. My teeth too white. My shaking hands prodded at my face, at someone else's face. So many faces, so many skin grafts. The thought was violent, sending tremors through me. How many people was I wearing? I started to claw at my arms and legs, my face. How many fucking people had I been? I grabbed a knife and tried to slice at my face, but there was no blood. How could there be no blood? When I got home, I found my family waiting for me. Mom, Dad, and Harry, all of them beaming. Bree! Mom stood up, her lips stretching into a grin. My mouth was already moving, but they were not my words. Mom! I didn't know why she was smiling so much until I saw Sam sitting at our dining room table. His smile was too big. His over-expensive shirt and pants did not suit him and looked fucking gross, but somehow my brain thought it was hot. The worst part is, I couldn't and still can't tell which Sam he was. Was he the guy who told me the horrific reality of my existence, or was he another recycled, mindless suitor? This is Samuel, Mum said, and Sam slowly stood. He took slow steps towards me and kissed my hand. I saw the slightest smudge of scarlet in his lip, but his eyes were blank. In the corner of my eye, my father's eyes were glittering. Hello, Brianna, Sam said, and I swore. Now that I was awake, the walls were wolf whistling, laughing. Ooh! My town is a blip on the map. We're so small, so insignificant, not even a Google search will find us. I keep thinking if I tear at my skin, I will find who I am underneath. But I'm so fucking scared. I don't bleed. I don't think who I was still exists under so many layers. But even if this is just a cry into the void, please help us. I don't want to be Brianna Timberman. Story 2. The Carnival. It was the brisk night of mid-October when a group of friends and I were told about a haunt attraction about 20 minutes away from our college campus. I personally wasn't a huge fan of these types of things because they always felt off to me. I mean, what person decides to make money and fame off of making bloody and horrific scenes to traumatize people with? But after all of my friends unanimously decided to go, I knew I would end up there anyways. There were 6 of us that went. Myself, my roommates Connor and Mike, and 3 of our other friends, Jenny, Cassie, and Claire. We all sort of hung out these past few years and became close. My roommates had a tendency to act like morons most of the time, and Jenny and Cassie just encouraged them in return. but Claire was always my go-to out of our group. She was considerate, happy, and not bad-looking either. Unfortunately, most of our school thought so too, so I knew the farthest I would get was the friend zone. We all piled into Connor's van and made the trip to a place called Victor Sinister's Carnival of Screams. It was pretty far out into the countryside, about a solid 10 minutes away from any civilization. We pulled up into a gravel lot that was fenced off by metal poles with caution tape connecting them. There were maybe 10 cars at most, which made it odd that an attraction this close to Halloween would be desolate on a Friday night. We just wrote it off as being small, so nobody had likely heard of it. We approached a ramshackle entrance gate with a crusty and rotting sign that read Admission 9, which seemed fairly cheap for an attraction like this. We all approached the booth by the gate and were welcomed by a dirty and foul man who likely was homeless before this gig. He took our cash and walked into a back room but never came back with our change. Since it was just $1, we figured we would cut our losses and proceed. The path ahead of us was a dark and twisted path into the woods, where we could see lights blinking up ahead behind some trees. Mike and Connor played around with Jenny and Cassie, screaming and jumping out at them while they pretended to be scared. Claire walked up beside me and bumped my shoulder. "Are you scared?" she asked me, with a sarcastic smile. "Oh, yay. Absolutely terrified," I responded in my own sarcastic tone while laughing. Claire walked with me while we watched the other four mess around on our walk to the lights, which we could now see was a circus tent surrounded by wooden shacks. My dad would always take me to these kinds of things when I was younger, Claire told me. I knew her relationship with her father wasn't a good one. The details were foggy, but I recall a lot of abuse and neglect was involved. I hated it for her because she was such a soft and tender person who couldn't hurt a fly. "Did you like them? Like, was it something you enjoyed doing?" I asked her. She stayed silent for a moment with only the screams of our friends being heard. "Not really. Dad always brought me along with his friends because he thought it was funny to watch me be scared," Claire explained. I held my head down and apologized for bringing up a sore subject. She just giggled and told me it was fine. We approached the circus tent when a large clown mannequin that sat in a booth shot a green substance from its mouth and splattered all over Mike and Jenny. Mike laughed, but Jenny didn't see the humor of being covered in fake vomit. She almost started to cry when Mike reminded her that it was just fake slime you could buy at the store, and it would wash out. We walked under the archway of the tent to enter, all while Jenny wiped her hair out of the gooey substance. Inside was a bunch of stacked-up cages with various props and animals inside of them. Loud music played hauntingly in the background as we walked through the dark room. The first disturbing scene was a young actress, maybe in her 20s, was locked in one of the cages with her hands bound to the wall. She had realistic wounds and blood covering her town hoodie and jeans. She called out for help over and over, but we trudged onward to avoid the awkwardness of the situation. Connor and Cassie remained silent, but Mike and Jenny haggled the woman and tried instigating a reaction, but to no avail, only more cries for help. The next scene we entered was a room with 3 corridors in it. Before we could analyze the path ahead, an actor in full clown makeup jumped out and laughed. "Which way? Which way? Which way? Indeed. Pick a hall and have a ball. 2 of you young ones per path. Let's go." "Let's go! Don't make it last!" the clown shouted and pointed all around. We agreed to split into groups of 2 and proceed. Claire chose to go with me, which boosted my confidence tenfold. The other 4 wandered down their paths, laughing and screaming. Our path led to an outdoor area where witch-like actors and actresses were having a séance of some sort. They all stopped simultaneously and turned to face Claire and I, who stopped dead in our tracks. They rose to their feet and grabbed Claire's arm gently while they guided her to the middle of the circle they were sitting around. They all then chanted something over and over while she stood there giggling at what was about to happen. Suddenly, they all grabbed something from their pockets and threw them at Claire. She screamed in a panic and bolted towards me while the coven of witches laughed. It turns out they threw live spiders at her, which is one of her biggest phobias. As she ran and grabbed onto my arm, one of the witches approached us and before we could react, jammed a spider in Claire's mouth. She screamed much louder than before and spit the spider out while gagging. I shouted at the actress, who was now fleeing the scene and into the woods. I turned around to see Claire was throwing up where we stood. I ran to check on her, all while dodging the spots of bile around me. "Claire, are you okay? Did it bite you?" I asked in a panic. "No, I don't think so. What the heck kind of person does that?" she said in a disgusted and weak voice. I consoled her as we noticed a doorway light up that seemed to lead back into the main tent. This room was an odd one. There was a straw dummy spinning on a big target on a stage. A skeleton in a barker's outfit sat up via a rope that hoisted the drop to a standing position. "Come on. Come all!" "Hit the dummy square in the head to open up the hall," said a speaker that sat by the prop skeleton. A bucket of axes and knives was then lit up in front of us. I looked at Claire, and we both shrugged and approached the bucket. Grabbing the first knife, I threw it at the dummy only for it to bounce off. "You have to throw it like you mean it." "Stupid," Claire heckled. "Oh, by all means." "Web breath," I instigated, while handing her an axe. I guess it was still too soon because she just shot me a piercing gaze and clutched a knife. She quickly threw it fast as a bullet, and the knife sunk into the dummy's chest. She turned to me and made a mocking smile. I smiled back at her, at least happy that she was happy. We waited for the door to open, but nothing happened. "Wait. It has to be a headshot. Chest shots don't count," Claire said in a determined voice. She approached the bucket once again and prepared to fire. With a well-aimed shot, she hit the dummy in the leg as it continued to spin. The spot in the chest began to leak a red substance, which we presumed to be a poorly put-together mixture to imitate blood. Claire huffed as her determination began to dwindle. "Having trouble? Here's some help. Now on the double," the intercom chanted. A small box fell from the catwalk above and landed on the ground. It was a single revolver, with what looked like only one shot in the chamber. Claire and I exchanged looks, and without hesitation, we both turned our eyes to the dummy. I grabbed the gun and pointed at where I knew the dummy's head would be once it rotated. Claire shouted for me to fire nearly 10 times before I finally pulled the trigger. I was shocked to find out it was a real gun that, to my surprise, fired a real shot. Aside from how dangerous that was, we both noticed where the head of the dummy used to be. Nice shot, but I think it was a little extra to put that much fake blood into a dummy. "That stuff got on my shoes," Claire shouted. I looked over to see the doorway was now lit. Claire and I walked over to it as we passed by the now stationary target with the dummy on it. We both audibly grunted as the smell of whatever they filled it with passed through the air. One thing that stood out to us that made us feel uneasy was the only people we had passed or even seen were now walking past us in the corridor. But they didn't look like they were up for conversation. They seemed worried and on edge, making a point to bolt right by without even making eye contact. We shrugged it off as just people being scared and entered the last room. Inside, we found Cassie crying on the floor, covered in blood and bruises. We ran over to her and knelt down. "Cass! What's wrong? Where is everyone?" Claire asked in a worried tone. Cassie turned to us with wide eyes and looked shocked to see us. She was crying hysterically, and neither of us could understand her for a brief moment. "This place, it isn't a show. It's real. I saw them. They took Connor and Jenny," she said in between breaths. I looked over at Claire as we helped Cassie to her feet. She cried out in pain as we raised her up. She had a broken leg. We could see the bone sticking out. "Cassie, who did this to you?" I asked in a panic. She looked past me and screamed. A large figure emerged from a cage that was freshly open and bolted into the darkness at the other side of the room. That thing did," Cassie yelled. I turned to look at my surroundings. There were more cages stacked around us, each with different nameplates on them. Most of the cages were tiny and held small creatures in them, but several were large and could easily fit a human. One cage read, "Harry the Hare," which was smashed to pieces with its resident nowhere in sight. Another reads Sally Snake. The one we saw open read Abe the Ape, and it was now empty. Cassie cried in a panic as she looked around for the beast. Just then, Mike knocked over a wall and light flooded into the room. He was visibly hurt and limping. "Guys, we have to get out of here." "This plut," he said as he was cut off abruptly. Mike was by his ankles into the dark corner Abe resided in. We all winced, and Cassie cried as we stayed silent out of fear. First we heard Mike screaming, and then the screaming stopped instantly. The noise that followed was an awful, meaty crunching noise that sounded horrific. We all took this opportunity to make a run for the now open exit, courtesy of Mike. As we passed his last location, the beast's glowing eyes peer up at us from his meal. We didn't hesitate to keep running. The room we ended up in was a flashy and colorful room. Polka dots and stripes lined the dirty cloth walls of the tent. The room filled with clowns of all shapes and sizes. But the ones that concerned us were the ones dressed in doctor's outfits and surgical clothing. A female nurse with clown makeup approached our group, who stood at the ready to fight if we needed to. "Oh dear. Honey, you look hurt. Let's get you patched right up," the nurse said in a sinister tone. "Back off. Get out of our way, you sick freaks," I shouted at her. Claire and I were holding up Cassie due to her injuries, but we felt Cassie get yanked back by a group of clowns who threw her onto a nearby table. She cried out in pain as they removed her bloody and torn clothes and replaced them with a dirty hospital gown. I wanted to intervene, but I couldn't bring myself to leave Claire alone. Not after what I was witnessing happen to Cassie. "We're losing the patient," said a tall clown, now reaching for something in his bag. Cassie screamed and kicked at her assailants, but it did nothing. "We'll have to amputate." "Boss," a short clown said to the nurse. A nurse shot the clowns a twisted smile as Cassie flailed even harder, knowing what was about to happen. The clowns then all grabbed her arms and legs and pulled in different directions. We watched in horror as the event played out. First we heard the crunches, and then we heard the tears. Finally, we saw Cassie's limbs give way like a wishbone. Claire screamed, but I was just left speechless. Cassie tried to scream too, but she couldn't muster a sound. The killing blow came from the nurse, who pulled out a large mallet with the word "flatliner" written across it. She brought the hammer down and reduced our friend's head to nothing but paste. The clowns turned their twisted gaze over to us, and we knew if we didn't act fast, we were dead. Claire backed up. She had tears swelling in her eyes as she whispered, "Please." "No, no," over and over again. I backed up as well, but my foot met a large canister of gasoline, thinking faster than I ever have before. I grabbed the can and dumped the contents all over the ground. All I needed now was an ignition source, which I found by an exposed wire dangling by Claire's head. Upon contact, the whole floor lit up like a bomb, and I turned to Claire and shouted for us to run. We ran back through all of our previous rooms, before finally reaching the outdoor area that the witches were at. I grabbed Claire and told her to run into the woods and not to stop until she finds help. She begged me to come with her, but I knew I could distract them long enough for her to escape. Reluctantly, she ran towards the trees, but as she set foot into the circle on the ground that the coven had drawn, she fell to her knees. She screamed in pain. It was a sound that made me shake. The cry grew louder and louder until I saw the witches emerge from behind her. They whispered something under their breath as I charged the nearest one and pummeled them to the floor. I grabbed the witch and beat relentlessly until I noticed none of the others were coming to her aid. "What did you do to her?" I shouted, raising my fist again to strike her bloodied face. She just laid there, cackling and coughing. I heard Claire stop screaming as a nightmare of sequences played out. First, laid on her back, coughing and gagging. Then, thousands of yellow and red glowing spiders poured out of Claire's mouth. They had thoraxes that resembled balloons or even the circus tent itself. They crawled around the ground surrounding Claire, who was now motionless on the dirt symbol. I ran over while the coven was distracted by the tiny spiders and scooped Claire from the floor. I had tears swelling in my eyes from the thought of my now possibly dead best friend. But not letting my feelings take over, I looked into the tree line and ran. I didn't stop for nearly 3 miles when I saw the light of a gas station in the distance. I heard the laughs of the circus echoing through the woods and cornfields as I ran towards the light. When I arrived, I was relieved to find regular patrons instead of more actors. I called for an ambulance and the police. I tried to explain everything to them before they went to investigate. I opted to ride in the ambulance with Claire to the hospital, and to my greatest relief, she showed signs of life, and eventually came to. She had countless bites all over the inside of her body, and an odd toxin within her that caused her to hallucinate for a while, but over time it faded away. The police called me around 3 or 4 hours after they left to investigate and asked me to go to the station to talk about what was found. When I got there, I was immediately asked to identify 3 bodies that had been found. I shuddered at thinking of my friend's demise, but knew I was the only person capable of identifying them right now. The first was a body that seemed like it had been put through a wood chipper. Bones were gnawed and chewed on, some limbs even removed entirely. I knew that this had to be Mike. The next was a torso covered mostly by a blanket. Judging by the horrific carnage that had unfolded hours prior, I knew this was what was left of Cassie. Finally, a body was shown that seemed mostly intact, but lacked a head. It was as if it had been blown off by a cannonball. I didn't recognize the body at first, but when I was told this body was found, strapped to a large wooden target, I didn't want to dwell on what had truly happened. The police told me that Jenny had actually been found alive. When they arrived, she was chained into a cage with a dirty clown outfit on and poorly drawn face paint. She was in no mood to speak to anybody and was traumatized beyond words. I couldn't blame her. If she witnessed half of what we had witnessed, then that would be enough. Claire eventually recovered after about a week. When we left the hospital, she never left my side. As of writing this, it's been 4 years since that night, and Claire and I are now engaged. I'm only writing this now because I've been seeing more than one post or account discuss the very situation we went through. They all describe a circus in a desolate area that had frighteningly real sets and scenarios. One account even reported that a friend of theirs had gotten lost and was yet to be found. I almost wanted to tell them what likely had happened, but I wish I had the luxury of being naive to this situation myself. Let this memoir be a warning to all of you. Don't trust places or things that appear to be fake. You would be surprised at how often evil disguises itself as more evil. Story 3. June 20th, I am Percival, a retired officer of the law, and the tale I'm about to unfold took place a decade ago. Why break my silence now? The date looms near, and I can no longer bear the weight of these memories. Sleep has eluded me for a week, so forgive any inconsistencies or errors in my account. The year was 2013, when I found myself reassigned to a quaint little town known as Holly Forest. Nestled against a forest to the north, it was home to a mere 300 households. Having left the chaos of city policing in my late 30s, this sleepy town was the sanctuary I sought. Crime was virtually non-existent, save for the occasional drunken brawl or petty theft. But on June 5th, 2013, that tranquility was shattered. I reported for duty at 6:30 that morning, greeted by the warm smile of our ginger-haired receptionist. I must confess, I harbored a bit of a crush on her. As I made my way to my office, I found my superior waiting for me, accompanied by a stranger. A woman in her 30s, her dirty blonde hair and crisp suit screamed, "FBI." Chief Davidson introduced me to the FBI agent, Claire Schmitz, who greeted me with an air of cordiality. After exchanging pleasantries, Davidson revealed the reason for their visit, a mysterious package that had arrived that morning. Why would the FBI send an agent for such a mundane task? I asked, examining the VHS tape Davidson handed me. "You'll have to see for yourself," he replied. Claire handed me a nondescript cardboard box, devoid of any address, in which the tape had arrived. I inserted the tape into our antiquated VHS player, connected to an equally outdated TV set. The screen flickered to life, revealing a tiled wall, seemingly part of a kitchen. As I fast-forwarded through the footage, my colleagues watched in silence. 10 minutes in, the horrifying reason for the FBI's involvement became clear. The camera panned slowly across the kitchen counter, zooming in on the face of a child, a girl of perhaps 7 or 8, with dirty blonde hair and a small smile. My stomach churned as my mind raced through the worst possible scenarios. The camera continued its slow pan, revealing another girl, and then another. In total, 8 girls, all appearing to be between 8 to 10 years old, all smiling, all with their eyes closed as if asleep. The footage ended abruptly, returning to the tiled floor. I was left speechless, feeling as though I'd just watched a preview of a murder case, the very kind I'd hoped to leave behind in the city. I turned to my colleagues, who seemed to be waiting for answers I didn't have. "What is this?" I asked, trying to maintain my composure. "We don't know," Davidson confessed. "The package arrived around 4 a.m., with no address and only that tape inside." "Have you checked for fingerprints?" I asked, my voice shaky. "It was clean," Claire replied. "We sent a copy to headquarters to try and identify the girls in the video." "And?" I pressed, my anxiety mounting. "Nothing," she replied, leaving me stunned. "What do you mean, nothing?" "We couldn't identify the girls. With the limited information we have, it would take a significant amount of time to sift through the data." "Time we don't have," I finished her sentence. "What about the tape? Any significant details? Do we know when it was recorded?" I asked, desperate for answers. "Yes, we do," she replied. "According to the tech lab, the tape was recorded in April." "Okay, when in April?" I interrupted, taking a large gulp of my now cold coffee to quell the nausea building in my stomach. "The tape was recorded in 2024, she finished, looking as dumbfounded as I felt. "How is that possible?" I exclaimed, jumping up and spilling coffee all over my desk. "That was my reaction too," Davidson admitted, handing me a ragged towel. "We suspect the tape may have been tampered with. Our team is working on it as we speak," Claire added, as I attempted to clean up the mess. "So, what's our next move?" I asked, tossing the soaked towel into the trash bin under my desk. Claire retrieved a laptop from a hard case she'd left on the bench under the window. "We found a frame in the tape," she said, opening the laptop to reveal an image of a white wall with a series of coordinates written in black ink. The coordinates led us to a small cabin deep in the forest near the town. As we speak, a team of experts is combing through the place. HQ believes that you, as the sole investigator in this station, and with your reputation for hunting serial killers, should be involved. "So, we're heading to the cabin then?" I pushed myself up from my chair, fighting against the weakness in my knees and the turmoil in my stomach. I managed to steady my voice. "Unless there's any other information you're not at liberty to share at the moment?" I studied her closely, gauging her reaction. My past experiences with the FBI had taught me they had a knack for withholding what they deemed unnecessary information. She shook her head in response. "No, I'm not withholding any information. We should get going. The forensic team is waiting for us." Already feeling the strain, I relinquished the driving duties to Chief Davidson. His Wrangler Jeep tore through the city streets, then into the forest, and finally down a narrow dirt road. The cabin came into view quickly, a hive of activity in the otherwise serene landscape. It was swarming with agents, some clad in biohazard suits, others in yellow vests, meticulously collecting samples from every inch of the cabin and its surroundings. Stepping out of the Jeep, a sense of foreboding washed over me. Despite the tranquil surroundings, I felt as though I was in the wrong place at the wrong time, each step drawing me deeper into trouble, the reason for which eluded me. A yellow-vested agent approached us, answering Claire's query with a shake of his head. "Nothing. The place is spotless. We checked with the town office. This cabin isn't recorded anywhere. Forensics estimates it was built about 10 years ago, and judging by the overgrowth, it's been deserted for just as long." "So the cabin was built but never occupied?" I asked. "Yes, sir," he confirmed, adding, "but the interior tells a different story. The cabin is in pristine condition." He gestured for us to follow him inside as the agents in biohazard suits cleared out. The cabin itself was unremarkable, constructed of walnut wood and well preserved, with no signs of nature's encroachment. Even the 2 windows overlooking the area were spotlessly clean. I ascended the 3 steps to the wide open door, the interior surprisingly clean and devoid of any furniture. But the kitchen wall, it was the same wall from the opening of that tape. What I hadn't noticed before was the peculiar design on the tiles. Each one was painted with an eye in the center, a blue eye, not human, but reminiscent of Saruman's eye from Lord of the Rings. Each eye was surrounded by a mass of green, bush-like strokes, as if concealing the owner of those eyes. A chill coursed down my spine, amplifying the unease that had taken root within me. The counter was unmistakable. It was the same one from the tape. This was indeed the place. The floor was constructed of the same hardwood as the rest of the cabin. There was only one other window, offering a view of the area behind the cabin. I moved around the kitchen counter, positioning myself where the camera had been placed in the footage. But there were no white walls to be seen, no signs that anyone had ever inhabited this place. It was as if the cabin existed solely for the purpose of that chilling tape. The mystery deepened, the silence of the cabin echoing the questions swirling in my mind. I left the cabin in disarray, taking a walk around to where the 3rd window overlooked. There was nothing, but the sense of dread kept intensifying. Despite the chirping of the birds and the sound of a nearby river, I felt increasingly nervous with each passing moment. A fever seemed to be building within me. I tried to inspect the surrounding area, but my strength gave out. I awoke, soaked in cold sweat, back in my office, sprawled on the bench under my office window. Davidson had driven me back when I collapsed. A doctor was called, who attributed my fainting spell to overwork and exhaustion, but that couldn't be the case. I hadn't had a single case for the last 6 months that would warrant such stress, and I'd been sleeping well every night. He prescribed some medication to regain my health back, but regain from what? I asked Davidson about the case at hand. Nothing. Forensics had no new information beyond what we were briefed earlier. Claire had left moments before to check into a small motel down the main road. It seemed like the case was a dead end, or so I thought. I think that's enough for now. I can hear them calling. I'll continue writing when the calls stop, hopefully by morning. The remainder of that day passed in a blur of illness so intense that I found myself leaving the office early. I headed to my modest flat, nestled within an apartment complex. Yet everything seemed different, altered in some indefinable way. As I pulled into the parking lot, an unshakable sense of impending doom gripped me. I was in trouble again. I could feel it. Boarding the elevator to ascend to the 5th floor, I tried to convince myself that the shadows I saw reflected in the cabin's mirror were mere figments of my fevered imagination. But I was gravely mistaken. The shadows were real, and they were only the beginning of the nightmare that awaited me. Have you ever found yourself in a room unable to recall why you entered in the first place? That was the sensation that washed over me as I opened the door to my apartment. The furniture seemed to pulse subtly, as if alive. Terrified by the thought that I was losing my sanity, I switched on all the lights in the apartment. The room looked bizarrely strange, bathed in the red glow of the setting sun streaming through the lone window. Didn't my apartment have a balcony? Adding to the strangeness, I had left the office around 4, and the drive had only taken 5 minutes. How was it possible that the sun was setting in the middle of the afternoon? But these questions faded away as the synthetic white lights of my small chandelier flickered to life. In the blink of an eye, the room returned to its familiar state, just as I had left it that morning. I confess, I was too ill to care. I swallowed a handful of pills with a glass of milk, too exhausted to question the oddities of the day. I immediately collapsed onto my not-so-comfortable bed, surrendering to the pull of sleep. For reasons I couldn't recall, I awoke hours later, engulfed in total darkness. I fumbled for my phone only to find myself unable to remember the password. The digital clock on my nightstand glowed 2:24 in a harsh red light. I assumed the power company had experienced a glitch and needed to reset their systems, causing the blackout. But I was sorely mistaken. I never close my bedroom door, and I always keep a Ruger LCP under my pillow, a chilling gift from a serial killer back when I started my career. It was 2009, and the killer, who never made the news, broke into my New York apartment and tried to shoot me while I slept. I survived, mostly because I was waiting for him under my bed. Now, standing in the doorway of my room was a shadowy figure. Despite the darkness of the apartment, I could see it clearly. It towered at least 8 feet tall, and as it drew closer, the hairs on my arms stood on end, a paralyzing fear gripping me. The creature had the body of a man but contorted. Its hands were much longer than a human, and its head was anything but human. Slightly oval-shaped, with small dot-like eyes that burned with a menacing red light. Its snout was long and curved upward. It limped towards me slowly, filling the room with a hot, dry air that made breathing increasingly difficult with each passing moment. As my stomach churned, my reflexes kicked in. I reached for my handgun and fired 3 bullets in quick succession. 2 found their mark in its head, while the third pierced its heart. The creature howled in agony as I tried to steady my fever-ridden hands, dropping the gun and fumbling to turn on my phone's flashlight. As the flashlight beam hit the creature, it vanished before my eyes. I scanned the room in the dim light of my rapidly discharging phone, a harbinger of the impending return to my personal hell. Fear gripped me, my feet numb, paralyzed. Worse still, I had only 2 bullets left, as I discovered with trembling hands when I checked the clip of the Ruger. That's when I heard them. Shadows began to form around the room, deep, unnatural shadows with no visible source. They only intensified as I shone the light on them. In moments, my room was no more. I found myself sitting on my bed in the middle of a sea of thick darkness. The room filled with hot air that burned my nose and eyes. I almost didn't want to breathe in as I heard the first call. From the corner where my closet was situated, a deep voice began to call to me. "We mean no harm, just kill the light. Let us see you." I retched in reflex, my body trying to expel a poison I hadn't consumed. A second voice joined in, a woman's voice, soft and inviting, almost seductive in nature. As the first wave of shadow hit the bed, other voices joined in. "Let us help you, Percival," a child called to me. Somehow the girl's voice sounded familiar. The voices grew louder and louder each time they called and heard no answer. I grabbed the gun with my shaking hands. With no feeling in my feet, I attempted an escape, collapsing into the dark sea of shadows at the foot of my bed. As the air began to flee from my lungs, I managed to crawl the short distance between my bed and the doorway. As I crossed the threshold, their calls grew louder and louder, shouting at the top of their lungs, commanding, begging, enticing me to return. Their sounds faded into growls of despair as my numb feet crossed the threshold of the doorway. The light came back in a flash, and strength returned to my feet. I couldn't get back to sleep that night. I only sat in the small living room with the TV on. I waited for the sun to come. The voices didn't subdued until the first rays of sun hit the curtains on the window. I suppose that's it for now. I'll continue the story when the sun comes up. Story 4. I'm a janitor at a laboratory, and I think they're doing human experiments in here. A few weeks ago, I started working as a janitor at a research facility just outside of town. It was just a quick, easy job to earn some pocket money before school started again. That was until I started witnessing strange things. And today, I found something that I'm sure shows they're experimenting on humans. I don't know. I suppose I should just tell you all everything that's happened so far. Even during the interview, I waited around in the lobby and noticed how deadly silent it was. I didn't even want to breathe, since I felt as if I would draw all the eyes in the room to me. I was sitting on this rock-hard plastic chair, uneasily shifting as the natural anxiety of a job interview carved a pit in my gut, trying the tactic of taking note of things you can see, hear, feel, smell, taste. I scanned my eyes around the room. The dim hum of overhead fluorescent lights and whirring of ceiling fans caught my attention first. The lights were giving me a headache. Then, I sneakily took a look at the other people in the room. There were 3 others, 2 men and a woman. They were all older than me, maybe 60 or 70, graying hair and wizened skin, but they all seemed unusually frail, their skin draping from their bones like their flesh had been suctioned out. And it was so quiet. I couldn't even name more than 3 things I could hear. The lights, the fan, my heartbeat. I couldn't even focus on the other senses. I was too distracted by these people. None of the others were looking anywhere but the shiny vinyl flooring, a somewhat vacant expression behind glazed eyes. They were sat multiple seats apart, but all united with the exact same expression of resignation, sadness. I'm not really sure, but it made me feel unsettled, like they knew something I didn't. After a few more minutes, a woman draped in a white lab coat and professional-looking attire poked her head through a door. "June Collins," she called out, glancing up from a clipboard, her eyes searching the room until she eventually noticed the old woman standing up. She smiled warmly towards her and led the hobbling woman through the door. The 2 men didn't look up. It took another 20 minutes or so for anything else to happen. A different door opened, and a man spoke out this time. He called out my name, and I followed him through to a tiny concrete box of a room with nothing more than a metal table and chairs. The interview went fine. He introduced himself as, I don't think I should say his name. Dr. Smith will do. That's vague enough. He asked the basic questions of why I wanted to work there, what I did in my free time, where I saw myself in a few years. I just answered with fancy-sounding phrases I had prepared the night before, and I got the job. There wasn't anything else of note that day. Dr. Smith let me go home, and I didn't really think about the 3 other people in the waiting room again. My first few days went okay. I would just put my headphones in and quietly clean the building all day. There was a rule I had to follow, though. If I were to go down into the basement to pick up cleaning supplies, I would have to get Dr. Smith to follow me. I didn't really know why, until maybe the 5th day. It was an awkwardly quiet elevator ride down, a gentle lull of calming music easing the tension. I assumed it was my fault that the mood felt so strained since I'm terrible at speaking to strangers, and I feel like I radiate some kind of "this girl is uncomfortably awkward to talk to. Do not approach her force field." However, I ended up noticing how stressed Dr. Smith always looked during that elevator trip. He's not that old, maybe 30 or so, but the lighting in the elevator highlighted every dent and wrinkle in his skin, casting deforming shadows onto his features that twisted his face into an obscured, sagging malformation. He always stands stiffly and tightly clenches his fist, repeatedly darting his eyes to the little LED screen that displays the floor as if desperate for the ride to be over. It only began to make sense on that particular day. Like usual, I made my way towards the cleaning cart, but noticed that the bleach was empty. Mindlessly, I did a quick scan of the room and saw a spare resting on a shelf in a darker part of the room. I made my way towards the shadowy abyss, but just as I was about to grab it, the silence was shattered by a shrill screeching right beside me, alongside the grating sound of rattling metal. I flinched away and made this humiliating, wobbly, yelping noise. Dr. Smith soon came jogging over from the elevator. Once I turned, I saw that there was a cage on the shelf next to me, as well as tiny wrinkled hands and a furry face with bared rows of teeth thrashing inside of the metallic cage. There was a monkey inside. Maybe it was a monkey. I don't know. Some sort of small ape thing. And it was furious. It howled and screeched as it clenched the bars and shook the entire structure, hissing at me as if it wanted nothing more than to shred my face apart. It continued to writhe in pure rage, only for Dr. Smith to start laughing calmly behind me, patting my shoulder in a friendly manner. "Oh, you scared me," he chuckled lightheartedly. I was frozen in shock, but he couldn't have been more impassive about the shrieking creature in front of him. He barely even raised his voice to be heard over it, and I could only just about hear him as he spoke. "That's Isaac. Don't worry about him. He's just shy." Isaac, this wailing creature, continued to violently shake the cage and scream at me, eventually resulting in banging his fist against the cage and even slamming his entire body up against it over and over. He just wouldn't stop. I began, desperately trying to regulate my breathing. "I thought you weren't allowed to experiment on animals anymore." "What?" Dr. Smith exclaimed, furrowing his eyebrows concernedly and scrunching his face in disgust as he quickly shook his head. No, dear. You've got it all wrong. Isaac's a friend." My eyes slowly wandered from the screeching monkey to Dr. Smith, who was already ignoring the creature as he brushed off his suit and turned on his heels back towards the elevator without another word. I don't even know what I was supposed to say in that situation, what I was supposed to ask him. It already took a great effort for me to speak up in any situation, and by the time I had summoned the mental courage to talk, he was already standing inside the elevator, giving me a brief wave as the metal doors slid shut. I was a little confused as to why he left, since I had never been alone in the basement before, but I didn't want to spend any longer down there than I had to. I let out a wobbly exhale and turned to grab the bleach and leave. When I turned, Isaac had stopped screaming. It was so sudden that it almost startled me as much as when he had started screaming and thrashing around. Instead of wildly flinging his arms and legs around, he had just stopped. He had stopped screaming, stopped moving. He was now standing up straight with a tall, stiff posture and his short arms hanging at his sides. Human-like, he had this blank stare on his face. His black, close-set eyes with a ring of hazel and a pinpoint pupil remained fixed onto me as he stared with a void, wide-eyed expression. It was like when models in a video game glitch out and revert back to their default pose. You know, I must have been standing there for minutes on end, basically shitting myself as this monkey stands up straight and just silently stares at me after acting insane a second ago. Eventually, I realized that I just had to leave. I was already on the verge of tears. As if trying to break free from solid amber, I managed to rip my feet from their spot on the concrete and step back, not wanting to take my eyes off of the monkey as I gathered the cleaning supplies I needed and dumped them onto the cart in a hurry. His eyes followed me around the room, neck craning to ensure he was always looking at me. Once I had everything I needed, I stumbled backwards towards the elevator so that I didn't have my back on him, aimlessly patting the wall behind me until I managed to open the elevator and stumbled into it, repeatedly slamming the close button as the sight was blocked by the doors. I did end up crying in the elevator, but I wiped my tears once the doors reopened on the ground floor and shoved my headphones in, distracting myself with work. The monkey couldn't have been the reason I wasn't allowed in the basement alone. Surely, since Dr. Smith had just left me alone with it. I don't know. I feel like I'm losing my mind. You might not understand why seeing some creepy monkey warrants human experiments, but please, just stay with me. Isaac the monkey was gone after that day, and I couldn't say I was disappointed about it. When I told Dr. Smith about what had happened, he had scoffed at me and said a slow, "Right," in an unimpressed tone, like he thought I was lying. I didn't say anything after that, shutting my mouth in embarrassment. I just thought that it was one of those creepily self-aware monkeys, the ones you see online that do things like write or put on clothes. Maybe it was playing a prank on me, trying to scare me on purpose. I don't know. The next incident was 3 days later. It happened on the 3rd floor. where I had to wear protective gear like face masks and gloves, since they handled infectious diseases on that floor. I had placed some wet floor signs in an empty hallway and was mopping the ground, even though it was perfectly clean. I was just bored while listening to music. A couple moments later, I heard this metallic groaning noise from inside a nearby room, like a rusty iron door being pulled open. Taking out my headphones to listen closer, it was still muffled behind the wall, but still loud. I couldn't guess what it was, but it sounded large and withered, also kind of like the low horn of a ship. Something like that. I propped the mop up against the wall and followed the noise to a sleek metal door that had various bright yellow stickers on it, warning me of all the biohazards contained in the room. I thought that it'd be fine. I thought that if anything were really a hazard in there, they'd have some sort of lock on the door. Right. With that, I carefully creeped inside, excitedly grinning under my stuffy mask as I saw the room inside. To me, at least, the room was mesmerizing. Despite the suffocatingly strong smell of chemicals lingering in the air, I stepped further inside to get a closer look at all of the intricate stations with flashy computers, microscopes, sparklingly clean flasks and test tubes piled on top of the glass countertops. The lighting in the room cast an electric blue hue over everything, making the room look like a movie set. I thought it was cool, but I didn't really understand where the biohazard was. There wasn't even anyone else in there. I heard the noise again. It was much louder and clearer, but still sounded like a deep, rumbling, metallic lamentation. I pinpointed it to the left of me, so I weaved through the rows of modernistic workstations and reached what looked like a garbage chute, a square iron hatch that seemed to lift up with a handle on the bottom. I assumed that this was where the hazard was, since the hatch was also drowned in red and yellow warning stickers. One peek wouldn't hurt. Checking either side of me to ensure that nobody was watching, I gently lifted the hatch open. As I did, I heard the sound again, and it was clear that it was traveling up the concrete tunnel from somewhere down below. I think it was because I thought I was alone that I ended up leaning forward and sticking my head into the chute in order to see what was down there. It wasn't what, it was who. Limbs sprawled out and pressed against the walls of the chute to keep himself propped up. A man seemed to be stuck midway through the chute, a few meters below me. I didn't really process what I was seeing for several seconds. I just stared at the back of this man's head as he looked down the chute. I could tell he was old, with thinning white hair and a spotty head underneath. His arms and legs were so withered that he looked like nothing more than a skeleton wearing tailored skin. I was surprised that they didn't snap, holding up the weight of him. I could also hear an unintelligible, distant discussion below the man, not so heated that it was an argument, but not calm enough to be a casual conversation. Before I even realized it was happening, however, the man slowly craned his neck up to make dead eye contact with me. I don't know why exactly, but I had almost expected him to have the same expression I saw on those other people in the waiting room, as well as the monkey. Instead, his mouth was hanging open, kind of like he didn't have any feeling in his jaw and couldn't close it. His gaping mouth was entirely black, void-like. He didn't have any teeth. He didn't have a tongue. I couldn't even see his throat. Just darkness. Then, he made the noise I had been hearing. I think I screamed, but I honestly can't remember. I was likely too horrified to do anything. All I remember is the feeling of my heart sinking in the abrupt terror of his limbs suddenly moving. Like when a spider suddenly crawls towards you after thinking it was dead, at a nightmarish speed. The man began to scuttle up the chute and towards me with a hostile desperation to reach me. I immediately retracted my head from the hatch and slammed it down, backing away as I continued to hear the muffled scrambling of his arms and legs growing closer as he rapidly clambered his way up the chute. In case he managed to open the hatch from the inside, I darted back towards the door, even bumping into one of the workstations and almost knocking a few empty flasks to the ground. When I reached the door, I flung it open to see Dr. Smith standing there, panting as if he had just sprinted there. "What on earth were you thinking?" he demanded. I didn't realize it then, but I'm now wondering how he even knew what had happened. It had been seconds since I took my head out of the chute, and there he was. What was that? I trembled. My limbs felt cold and numb, like my blood had been replaced with icy adrenaline. Frantically, I kept checking behind me to the hatch, fully expecting the man to crawl out of it and bound towards me. Look, it's... Dr. Smith stopped himself and exhaled, pinching the bridge of his nose out of stress. We try to keep dangerous patients below ground, so as not to scare employees like you. That's all. Dangerous patients, I repeated, utterly lost. Rabies, he hurriedly stated, as if that was supposed to clear up all of my questions. He must have noticed the blank, baffled look on my face, so continued. We're working on developing better treatment for the disease, so hospitals send rabies patients to us for examination and observation. It was in the news. Actually, you should have known that already. That guy had rabies. Dr. Smith nodded, but refused to meet my eye. He kept looking everywhere but at me, over his shoulder, behind me. He seemed to be stifling his nerves, which didn't help me feel any better about the situation. I think he was worried that someone would see us or was hasty to leave the conversation. But I'm not entirely sure. He chewed through his restraints and was trying to escape, I imagine. But try not to worry. They're kept downstairs for a reason. It's safe up here, I promise. I don't think I managed to hide the growing anxiety on my face, but it didn't matter anyway since Dr. Smith wasn't even looking anywhere near me. It's safe to say that I don't believe him now after the most recent incident, but at the time, it made sense to me. Plus, we have a tendency as human beings to blindly trust authority. As some teenage janitor, who was I to question the man in the white coat with a PhD? I didn't know any better, so I assumed that he was telling the truth, and I avoided that floor from then on. I didn't speak when I went home that night. My parents asked me how my day was, and I simply walked straight past them and into my bedroom, locking my door and not leaving until the morning for work. I skipped dinner and breakfast. I didn't even leave to use the bathroom or brush my teeth. Even though I only thought he was a rabies patient that had been sent in for treatment, something about him disturbed me to my core. I laid awake that night with his face burnt into my mind like a scolding hot iron, the sound of him scuttling up the chute haunting me. Finally, we reached today. I had somewhat recovered from the event after a week or so, but I still refused to go back to that floor. Pushing the thought out of my mind seemed to work, so my life carried on. Honestly, I never even told anyone about it until now, since Dr. Smith had somehow convinced me that there was nothing to tell, that it was a well-known fact they treated rabies patients. I almost felt like I was in trouble for what I saw, so I kept it quiet, like I was keeping my own secret instead of his. Anyway, earlier today I was in the women's bathroom on the 6th floor, kneeling underneath a sink and scrubbing the porcelain, rethinking all my life choices that led me to that point. I had music blasting in my ears and was quietly humming along, until I heard the door quietly creaking, like someone was trying to sneak in. I flinched slightly, feeling embarrassed that I had been caught humming, and whipped my head around to see who was coming in. I assumed that they didn't want to interrupt me, or something, so I paused before nervously calling out, "You can come in, I'm just cleaning." There was no answer, but the door was open a crack, as if someone were cautiously waiting outside. I'll leave. I'm sorry," I said, guessing that whoever was waiting was uncomfortable using one of the stalls whilst I was in there. With that, I quickly gathered all of the cleaning supplies around me onto the cart and brushed myself off as I stood up. When I turned to head towards the door, I stopped in my tracks, frozen with the sudden shock of what I was seeing. That fucking monkey. There it was, standing upright, no taller than a foot or so. It might not have been Isaac. I wouldn't have been able to tell from appearance alone, but the way it stood there was directly reminiscent of when it was in the cage the other day. Now, however, it was blocking the door, just stood there motionlessly, staring at me with such human vacancy in its eyes. I felt an acute sense of vulnerability as the creature glared at me with wide pupils. I don't know what it was thinking, I don't even know if monkeys do think. I was completely paralyzed, other than the violently shaking in my hands. The room felt hot and cramped, painfully contrasting with the ice-cold blood rushing through my veins. I had heard the stories of monkeys or chimpanzees or whatever brutally mauling people, and images of the creature clawing away at my face flashed in my mind as I stared back. My chest tightened as if my ribcage was closing in on my lungs, just like the jaws of the claw clip tangled up in my hair. It only moved its mouth. It was so gradual and achingly slow that I didn't even notice it was opening until it was already slightly ajar, wider and wider. So unbearably slow, until eventually its jaw was gaping. It was black, no teeth, no tongue, no throat. A pitch-black hole like its mouth was yet another pupil. I was already crying, already on the brink of throwing up. I thought that I was about to pass out. Looking back, it was only a tiny thing, and I probably could have kicked it away if it had come any closer. But in the moment, I was beyond petrified. It didn't come any closer, though it remained wide-eyed, mouth immensely agape and completely static for a moment longer, until it suddenly dropped down onto all fours. I let out a brief scream and stumbled backwards, since I thought it was going to come bounding towards me. But it instead made some sort of chirping noise and started biting at something on its fingers. It then climbed up onto one of the bathroom stalls, tail hanging and head curiously looking around the room, blinking and breathing. Normal. I didn't let myself stay in that room for any longer. I rushed towards the door as it perched on the stall and paid no attention to me at all, simply acting how you'd expect any monkey to act. Once I was outside, I slammed the door shut and scrambled for the keys in my pocket, shakily locking the bathroom shut. I needed to go find Dr. Smith and tell him that the monkey had escaped. So I made a beeline for his office, which was luckily already on that floor. The wooden door, a harsh juxtaposition to the rest of the soulless industrial structure, was shut. So I hurriedly knocked. Nothing. I knocked again, clearly conveying my urgency in the franticness of the banging. Still, nothing. I wasn't in my right mind. I was convinced that he must be in there and that I needed help. I don't know. I think the fact the entire floor was empty and devoid of life was stressing me out even more. I let out an exasperated exhale and decided to use the master key I had been given to get inside. I had been warned against using the key for unauthorized areas, such as the offices, but I wasn't thinking about that then. I think I was having some sort of panic attack. It was the most awful thing I've ever experienced. I genuinely thought I was about to go into cardiac arrest and drop dead. The key, to my surprise, slotted into the lock with a satisfying click, and I was able to open up the door to Dr. Smith's office. It was messy, like he wasn't expecting anyone but himself to see it. An ocean of papers and files completely covered his desk, as well as 3 old coffee mugs lying around discarded. The empty swivel chair was sticking out at an angle as if he had left in a hurry, and I noticed that one of the filing cabinets behind the desk was hanging wide open, a padlock dangling off the handle. The more I looked, the more apparent it came that he had rushed out. For some reason, I wondered if that was why everyone else was gone. The thought that they all knew about something I didn't only further sharpened my unstinting anxiety. The open filing cabinet caught my eye most, especially the padlock that had been recently unlocked. I had to, didn't I? You can't tell me you wouldn't do the same if you were me. I know I shouldn't have, but I approached it as if it were going to attack me too, peering inside to see nothing but a singular piece of paper lying flat at the bottom. I reached inside and flipped it over. It was all typewritten, which I had never actually seen before in real life. I read on in curiosity, and, well, I found myself throwing up in the trash can underneath his desk moments later. I had to get out of there after that. I know, it was stupid, but I kept the piece of paper in my hand as I rushed out of the building. I didn't see anybody on my way out, either. Usually, I would take the bus home, but since it was the middle of the day and I wasn't going to wait around any longer, I walked miles back to my house. My legs were burning, and a sheen of sweat was drenching my entire body, but I hardly even noticed. I dragged my sore body up to my bedroom and slumped down against my bed, feeling the smallest amount of relief at the cool sensation of the hardwood floor. That's when I reached for my laptop and began to write this. I suppose I should share what was written on the paper, but I'm honestly terrified. I've been considering the possibility that I'm just insane, that I somehow hallucinated all of it. I don't know. I don't even know if this is saying what I think it's saying. If I'm about to get sued for sharing this. I haven't said the name of the company, have I? I can't get in trouble for this. I don't know. I feel sick. I'm looking at the paper now and I want to throw up again. I'm sure that I wasn't supposed to see this. I think that this slipped out of a file and Dr. Smith accidentally left it behind. Maybe he was trying to dispose of it. That makes sense, I think. Maybe I'm just overreacting. I don't know. Okay, I'm sorry. I'm rambling. I'm just going to type it up and put this out there. I don't know what to do. I'm losing my mind. I feel really sick. Story 5. That girl makes D&D difficult for everyone involved. Context. Friend of mine wanted to get into DMing, so she offers to run a one-shot. Being new to the system and to being a DM in general, not too many people show interest, so myself and my GF both decide to join for a grand total of 4 players. The setting is a dino-themed island that's basically like Pokemon, where everyone has a dinosaur companion to help them do things. Stuff like a police force that rides on pterosaurs, yes. I'm aware they're not technically dinosaurs. Shut up. To farmers that have triceratops to pull their plows. That sort of thing. DM asks for humans only. But I ask about playing a Warforged. She actually has an in-world explanation for how Warforged would be in the world. So she approves the idea. She also has her own ideas on how magic works in the world, as it's not inherent, so nobody starts the game with spells. She also has each of us pick a dinosaur to have as a companion of sorts that will get introduced later in the story. Enter that girl and new guy. I'm playing a Warforged artificer. That girl, Warlock. New guy, Rogue, and GF, Ranger, all meet up in Discord with the DM, and we're off. The session starts on a ship. Due to myself and GF's backstories, only that girl and new guy are present at the time. They're essentially mid-Victorian era humans on a cruise when a storm begins to brew. New guy looks around for one of the deckhands to ask what's going on and where the location of the life rafts are if need be. Pretty sensible. That girl, who had never met this character before, suddenly appears next to him and starts berating the guy for asking about the lifeboats, because it would send people in a panic. New guy is naturally confused, because there's a fucking storm brewing, and people were probably already panicking regardless if he mentioned lifeboats or not. That girl cuts him off both in and out of character, literally going, I put my hand in his face and make him stop talking, to continue chewing him out for no reason. New guy literally cannot get a word in as that girl is harping on and on about think of the people. You can't say those things. This goes on for 15 actual minutes. Eventually the DM must have got tired of hearing this one-sided nonsense, so she just has the storm capsize the boat and the 2 players are lost at sea. DM describes the water as cold and dark, starts to describe what they feel in response before that girl immediately pipes up with, I cast light. Chapter 1. Light requires verbal components, and you're underwater. You can't speak. 2. Magic isn't inherent to you, so you don't have access to it yet. The DM has them both wash up on the shore and awaken about an hour later. She then describes the beach and the things they can see. There's a jungle that's further in, and a strange green object lying on the beach. My character is green, so naturally I start looking over my sheet, getting my voice modifier ready, doing all the prep work for introduction. DM describes the 2 of them finding a pair of glowing stones, crystals, that emit some strange type of energy. DM also goes into painstaking detail that the green object reacts to the stones whenever they get brought close. New guy tries to get his bearings, and that girl starts arguing with him about his plan, and that they should obviously try to look for civilization, which he was already planning on doing. But in order for that to happen, you kinda have to already have an idea of where you are. Cue another. 15 minutes of actual time spent ranting. All the time, the two of them are walking past the green object over and over again. DM eventually just describes that they get close enough to object for it to animate slightly, and asks me to introduce myself. Immediately grab stone from one of them, pry open the top of my head, and insert it to fully power on after 45 whole minutes of IRL time. Player 3 enters the game. Since I essentially wanted to make a robot with all kinds of integrated gadgets, I rolled up an armorer artificer that was true neutral, since his entire gimmick was essentially going to be that he was super agreeable to pretty much anything that wasn't obviously self-destructive or outright evil. I described myself powering up and looking over the other two, getting introductions all around. Finally, we might actually make some headway. They ask me if I know anything about the weird crystals. I confirm my knowledge with the DM before letting them know that they're essentially power sources that were used in my character's home. DM essentially told me that I was an Atlantean strider, and Atlantis was an advanced civilization before it sunk, and produced a bunch of crystals like the ones we were using. Actually, pretty cool concept. New girl had cut her leg at some point during the storm, so my character heals her up, and explains that the crystals can exhibit strange powers when wielded by various creatures, which only made them more rare. DM confirmed they were essentially focuses that enabled spellcasting. DM describes sounds coming from the jungle, and that girl starts vocally debating whether we should go in or not. Before this can turn into another 15-minute rant, I say my character immediately starts walking into the jungle to find the noise. A new guy decides to follow. That girl follows along, and the DM describes a large shadow in the distance. I try to walk closer. The DM describes the shadow moving away. This goes on for a few seconds or so before I just decide to cast light, illuminating the area around me and revealing a T-Rex. That girl immediately freaks. New guy is intrigued, and I'm basically the only one that noticed a woman was riding it in a saddle. The woman introduces herself and tells us that it's usually rare for people to wash up on the shores, but not entirely unheard of. Decides to lead us to her caravan heading into the main city. That girl is immediately firing off questions, not even letting her get a word in before asking a new one. This goes on for some time before we eventually get led to a surplus wagon with spare equipment we can use. We fall into the caravan, and finally, GF gets to introduce her character as she rides up to meet us, after an hour and a half of IRL time. Anyways, GF's character was native to the island and essentially worked as a caravan guard, and decided to join our odd group as a sort of chaperone. My character is chumming it up with a few NPCs, looking over equipment, asking about their culture, that kind of thing. We eventually make it to the city where we register our characters to the city's ledger. As we finish up, we hear a bunch of noise outside, kind of like a parade. We go to check it out and essentially see a guy on a palanquin being toted around by dinosaurs, going on about how he's going to bring glory to the island by breaking through to the rest of the world. The DM basically put a giant "This is the big bad" sign over his head. That girl asks what she knows about this guy, which is probably the first time she's actually asked if she was capable of doing something instead of just loudly narrating that she does it. DM says that this guy was actually native to her home, so she knows of him, keyword being of. That girl begins narrating how much she hates this guy and describes herself as accidentally casting sacred flame on him. Naturally, this gets his attention, but he can't really pick out the perpetrator from the crowd. The DM was essentially throwing that girl a bone, and you figured she'd get the hint, but nope. RV. That girl then describes herself as stepping out into the street and loudly detesting the guy, describing herself as always knowing he was a coward, ever since they were kids. Again, that girl was told she had cursory knowledge of this guy, and she proceeds to try and make him an integral part of her character. She tries to fight him, and basically only gets one eldritch blast off before he blasts her to the ground with Thunderwave and climbs back into the palanquin because this idiot wasn't worth his time. That girl gets up and angrily tries to convince the people to rally against him. Naturally, she put no proficiency into persuasion or deception, so the most she gets are a bunch of people staring at the crazy ranting girl firing off Cthulhu beams at people for no reason. My character finally steps up and mentions that if the island was separated from the rest of the world, there was probably good reason for it to be that way. My background was far traveler, so I had all eyes on me as a feature, which made people naturally more inclined to listen to me since I was a weird 6'1" round robot. A few of them recognized me as an Atlantean strider, which helped my words stick. This was a common thing in this game, with that girl loudly announcing that she was going to do something, fucking it up due to a fundamental misunderstanding as to how things worked, and my character picking up the slack and actually doing it. Small reminder, I had no idea what that girl's character was going to be. Her spell list, stat layout, none of it. My character just so happened to be better than her at pretty much everything. Never said it in-game, but silently I was actually enjoying getting to one-up her constant attention hogging. So, naturally, after one of our members decided to attempt political assassination, we decided that it was best to camp out innerwoods for the night. GF was our ranger, so she was able to find a suitable spot for us. That girl says she goes to start a fire with sacred flame. DM tells her that sacred flame isn't actually fire, but radiance, so it wouldn't work. I immediately start an actual campfire using firebolt. That girl is sulking around, loudly proclaiming that she can't do anything. The remaining three of us do some RP. The DM admits that she's kind of at a loss for what to do, since she was expecting us to stay in the city. You know, before that girl tried to JFK the big bad. That's no problem. We'll just keep role-playing while she thinks of how to continue the story. That girl immediately wanders over to a cave and goes, "I know." I walk over to this cave, and this thing walks out, before pulling out the token for her Dino companion and plopping it on the map. DM finally puts her foot down and says, "No, that doesn't happen. I just P-med you something, and need you to read it." None of us knew what the DM sent to her, but we all figured it was something along the lines of, "Quit hogging all the attention and trying to dictate the story." This is a group game. A few minutes later, that girl comes back and gives a half-hearted apology and explained that she wasn't trying to hog all the attention or be the main character. She was just excited. Most of us don't really feel it's sincere, but whatever. If the DM has a rein on her, then let's get the ball rolling again. The DM then comes out and says that it's my Dino companion that comes out of the cave. A little compsognathus. Immediately I'm bonded to this thing because it's adorable and it seems to get along nicely with me. The new guy jokingly asks if I have a name for it. I reply, "Not yet." New guy, "Not yet? That's a funny name for a pet." And thus my companion was named Not Yet. All one word. The DM sends us off to another region of the island that's full of canyons, mesas, cliffs, that sort of thing. It's where the pterosaur police are mainly stationed. Coincidentally, that girl's companion was also a pterosaur. We're walking along one of the cliffs when new guy mentions how far of a drop it is. He asks me if I know how far it actually goes down. I make an estimate of about 600 feet or so. It was actually closer to 700, but still. And he jokingly tells me I should jump down to make sure. I yeet myself over the edge. That girl immediately tries to say, I stop him before he jumps. Can we go back in time? That didn't really happen. Did it? Girl, I weigh like 220 pounds of green steel, and you weigh like 110 soaking wet, with a negative STR modifier to boot. If you try to stop me, you're going over too. I let the party freak out for a few more seconds before I cast slow fall and describe myself as activating tiny propulsion systems to slow my descent. I reach the bottom of the canyon, note that the actual distance is more like 700 meters, and look back up to them before I prepare to climb out with spider climb. Before I do, the DM basically has the pterosaur police show up because they just watched a guy yeet himself into the canyon and wanted to make sure he was okay. They offer me a ride back up and I accept. We eventually make it to the town of this region with a little cash to spend on things. I ask around to see if I can get a shield. DM explains that there usually isn't a lot of combat on the island, so shields were usually uncommon. No problem. I can work with what I have. That girl immediately describes herself, and I quote, as buying a new set of clothes and walking out in a skin-tight red and black flight suit. You can't make this shit up. We eventually make it to a pterosaur gathering place, where those that would bond to them take part in a ritual. The whole "you don't choose your partner, they choose you" straight out of James Cameron's Avatar. That girl is finally about to get her partner, and one of the NPCs essentially says to bond with them is a leap of faith. So naturally, her first instinct is to jump off the cliff. The DM is surprised, but decides to roll with it, getting ready to describe her partner swooping in to save her. But after realizing that leap of faith was not literal, that girl immediately changes her mind and begs for the DM to undo the last 12 seconds so she can just bond to them normally. DM relents. That girl is excitedly going on about her new mount partner and fangirling so much that she misses the plot hook. Big Bad had recently come through here and took a lot of the funding, mentioning that he was headed to another region. New guy gets his companion as we travel. A raptor, and GF already had hers, an allosaurus which served as her mount. So we finally have the full party, companions included. We camp out for the night. The DM allows us to level up to 6. We started at level 5. We make preparations to enter the next region, which was basically a heavy forest area. We pass through another small town, and I asked the DM if I couldn't buy a shield. Could I possibly make one from spare material? The DM agrees, says there's enough scrap metal around for me to make something like a shield. So I roll my smith's tools, a nat 20 plus tool expertise, plus an INT modifier of 4 gives me a total of 30 on the check. The most flawless shield ever created by a living being, practically equal to God quality, is made by my funky metal man. Immediately infuse it with repulsion shield for that sweet extra AC. The DM hand-waved the necessity to wait for a long rest to infuse it since it was a one-shot. The party moves along into the forest region as we follow the next clue. As we're moving along, we hear someone crying for help. Look into a clearing and we see a man with a bloody leg lying on the ground. Nothing else is around him at all, which is just strange. Guy like him would be easy meat in the middle of a dino jungle. A more obvious ambush could not be telegraphed. The Ranger, GF, and Rogue, new guy, were being cautious, trying to see if there was any signs of the person or creature that attacked him. That girl is loudly asking what they should be doing, and I just walk out into the middle of the clearing to cast Cure Wounds on the guy. That girl, not to be outdone, immediately runs up next to me to do the same. She was running Celestial Warlock, so she could have probably healed him from cover. But okay. Immediately, a T-Rex charges at both of us, spends one attack slashing at me with its hind claws, which actually gets through my 20 AC. I immediately react to use Repulsion Shield, blasting it backwards, and the T-Rex decides to go for the much squishier target and crits the shit out of that girl. It deals enough damage to nearly outright kill her. Obviously, she's sent unconscious. I'm rolling my eyes and spend another spell slot to Cure Wounds her back up. That girl basically summons her mount, the same one she wouldn't stop fangirling over and exclaiming how useful and wonderful of a companion it was, and proceeds to use it like a meat shield, while me and the other 2 members do all the work to drive it off. We manage to save the guy, and he tells us that the wildlife has been acting strangely ever since Big Bad came through the region. Get told that he's essentially headed back to the capital city. We hitch a ride on a river raft that fast-tracks us back to the capital, preparing to go to the city council to tell them that the bad guy was up to something. My GF goes into prepared speech about how much she loves her home and doesn't want to see it ravaged or cause harm by suddenly connecting it back to the rest of the world. That girl immediately launches into speech of her own that's twice as long and conveyed about a fourth as much information. Basically repeats all the points that GF made, sometimes multiple. I'm pretty sure she mentioned grandstanding at least 5 times. Ironic. The DM eventually has to cut her off to point out that there's a skeleton in the room. Literally. One of the council members had essentially been instant-aged into a mummy, and that girl had been ranting for about 5 straight minutes before noticing. Granted, GF had done a speech too, and was naturally a little embarrassed about going into a diatribe without checking the room first. But at least hers was concise. We learned that Big Bad had gone to the town square to do some big bad stuff, and we rolled up to stop him. Fight begins, and that girl immediately hops on her mount, flying around and blasting him from the air. I'm up front, tanking for my little companion. GF and New Guy are off to the sides picking at the minions, 3 T-Rexes that he had with him. That girl is essentially taunting Big Bad that he can't hit her from up here, flying back and forth the whole time. The Big Bad is sick of her shit and casts Earthbind. That girl goes from smarmy asshole to shitting her pants in about 2 seconds. Everyone else is stuck with a T-Rex, except me, because I managed to kill the one I was fighting, but was too far away to help. Big Bad starts blasting her and her mount, while she's desperately trying to find some way to cast more spells, use more actions, anything. She deadass asks at one point, if I sacrifice all my movement and bonus actions, can I take another action? Never in my life have I wanted to play fighter more than in that moment. I eventually make my way over and start blasting with Firebolt. Big Bad takes notice and flings attacks my way. I avoid most of them, but one of them hits my partner. Up until this point, my character's signature catchphrase had been, okay, to basically anything. Hey, jump off this cliff. Okay, can you heal me? Okay, take the night watch. Okay. But now his partner was hurt. I dropped my voice mod by a few octaves. Not. Okay. I blast him with magic missile. The fight between us breaks out on some duel of the fates type shit. Spells are being cast, weapons are being thrown, strategies being devised. Eventually, our group manages to consolidate and we manage to bring him down. He's not dead, but laid out on the floor. We go through his shit and loot his sword, which has a single wish spell, which was inactive until it was joined with a second MacGuffin we had picked up. He also had an elixir of health on him, which was good for that girl's backstory, since the reason she was on the cruise at all was to see if she could find a cure for her sister's unknown disease. Somehow, this isn't enough for that girl. She wants to cast some homebrew spell that makes him reveal an embarrassing secret so she can spread it to the world or whatever. Most of us had checked out of her shenanigans at this point and were just trying to finish the game. The DM actually decides to roll with it, and instead of an embarrassing secret, she decides to tell us his backstory. Essentially, this guy was getting Benjamin buttoned at some point in his life. He was cursed to begin aging backwards, and essentially had to time vampire other people to sustain himself. He watched his original family die, same with others he'd gained throughout his unnatural lifespan. More than anything, he just wanted his suffering to be over. So my friendly, true neutral Warforged, in a somber voice, simply replies, okay. I firebolt him 3 times, basically turning him into a solo funeral pyre. The characters all bow their heads in silence. Seems like that girl finally got a grasp on how to... Wait, I was muted. Guys, go back, don't kill him. God damn it. We go back, and she loudly goes over how she's taking the elixir of health and offering it to him for some reason. She's literally been beefing with this guy the whole game, and suddenly she wants to forsake her sister to save him. I start to point out that diseases and curses are different, and she cuts me off, going, let me finish. I think long and hard about whether I should be an asshole and just letting her waste it on him. But against my better judgment, I decide, once again, to tell her that using it on him would be a waste, since a curse is not the same thing as a disease. Eventually, we combine the sword and the MacGuffin to cast Wish and open a portal for that girl and New Guy to go home. She offers a letter to GF and narrates that GF opens and reads it. GF has none of that and says she doesn't read it, and haphazardly waves her off through the portal. The DM has a short epilogue where that girl travels back with her now cured sister. That girl starts to go on to another speech about how amazing this place was and how she was such wonderful friends with us. I cut her off, simply saying I barely know you, and I like GF's character better. The session ends, and we talk about the highs and lows, We tell DM our honest opinion about her style, essentially saying that for a one-shot especially, don't be afraid to nudge your players, because sometimes it's hard to pick a direction and go. We tell that girl, gently, that she needs to realize this is a team game, and that she's not the main character. Insert sputtering about, well, my friend is a DM and I hang out with him often, and I guess since I couldn't really pick a direction. Yeah, she used my exact words here, which came damn close to setting me off since she was clearly pulling this explanation out her ass. I just kind of tried to control the story so we could move again. I very firmly tell her that controlling the story isn't her job, and to leave that to the DM. A few weeks later, in another group chat, I vented about the session, and everyone confirmed that she single-handedly was the biggest problem with that game in particular. I learned from other friends that this isn't her first time pulling this shit either. All of us silently agreed to not invite her back. Story 6. I joined a health program that allows you to eat all you want. My mom keeps a scrapbook of photos holding several memories. Every photo that I was in followed the same pattern, at least until I turned 22. In these memories, I would be in the backyard running around with Trevor with my shirt off. Trevor is our family pit bull. Thank you very much. My body devoid of fat or muscles would expose the outline of my ribs. My arms would dangle by my hips, and my grin in need of braces would present no charm. All the way up till my third semester at community college, I thought I would have this exact physique until I died. Christ, do I now wish I could have still lived out that past insecurity. My usual school appetite of zero-sugar Gatorade and a side of apple slices had ceased a bit. I didn't suddenly have an epiphany where I looked down at my hollow exterior and realized that I should start putting more food in my system from then on. Nothing like that at all. My mother had called me the things she said, her voice, God. It was a cry that sent a shockwave through my body. At around 2 p.m., my father had a heart attack. Tragic, but it hadn't been unexpected, like what my body would later become. He too was a heavy individual. He spent most of his last few years on Earth breathing through an oxygen mask while he sat in a wheelchair on the backyard deck. After I had watched the man, my childhood hero, eat himself to death, lowered 6 feet under within a casket as my mom and I cried our souls out. It would have been the best time to use it as motivation to hit the gym. This hadn't occurred. Weeks after the funeral, I spent countless of checks at nearby fast food joints. The passenger seat of my car had filled up with empty food bags, wrappers, and several unfinished cups of vanilla-flavored coffee drinks. Don't even get me started on the piss bottles underneath my bed. With all of this, others thought of me as a lazy and heavy individual. What killed me was that they were right. I wouldn't stand in front of the mirror and look at my body and feel proud. I just couldn't. After I clocked out from one of my shifts during the late afternoon, I had passed a local burger joint on my way home. For once, a spark of willpower had shined deep within me. I drove past the location and had congratulated myself when I pulled up to my childhood home. That hadn't lasted long. When night came, I drove back to the place and feasted down on 2 double-doubles with a side of chili cheese fries. It embarrasses me to admit it, but I spent the next 2 minutes sobbing alone in my car as I finished the second burger. Humiliation over my weight hurt like fire. Unfortunately, comfort food didn't seem to hurt until it went down my throat. A few days later, I had received an ad on my laptop about a health program. I had been scratching Trevor's belly as I spent my time browsing random YouTube videos. That was when it popped on the right side of the screen. It had been a website that involved a program that specialized in healthier lifestyles. Yet, the company presented a routine where you could eat all you want. You wouldn't have to cut out all of the good, unhealthy stuff from your diet. You didn't even have to work out. As much as I would love to say that my future downfall would be for not reading the entire agreement of the website, that had not been the reason. Aside from the no diet or exercise for weight loss, I hadn't noticed any red flags regarding the program. I typed out my information on the contact form below and didn't hear anything for 2 days. That's when I got the call. A woman with a friendly voice had spoken on the other end. She set up a time and a date for when I could stop by the location. May 7th. When I arrived at the building, I noticed that the parking lot had been entirely filled up. I ended up parking at a local hiking trail on the other side of the street. When I made my way towards the location, a 3-story bricked building surrounded by spruce tress. I took note of the vehicles. While some of them appeared okay when it came to cleanliness, others had not. They were covered in thick coats of dust, along with the several dried and white droppings of bird shit. When I entered the building, I filled out a form at the front desk, and a male worker in scrubs wrote me a room number, 213. I found the room after going up to the 2nd floor. I'm surprised I hadn't taken note of how isolated the place felt. There was also a loud flushing sound from beyond the walls. It was the kind of noise you'd hear behind the door of a public restroom when you walked by. I found the room and waited inside. The pictures on the walls made me turn away and gag as soon as I realized what they were. There were several photographs of hands holding the removed and gold-like fat from patients. For some, it may have been motivating. For me, I was ready to lose my lunch. It hadn't been long until a thin woman with dyed blue hair entered the room and smiled. We talked for a bit about my weight, what was in my usual diet, and if I had always been this particular weight. She then took a file off a nearby table and pulled out a trio of photos. The first image showed a brown and box-like metallic belt. There were a pair of large and white tubes sticking out from both sides, and in the middle was what looked like a clear and round glass casing. The second photo had been of an obese man standing behind a brown backdrop, presumably around 300 pounds. If I didn't stop eating what I ate, I might have ended up looking like him. The third and final photo had been the same man. This time, he had slimmed down and was even putting on muscle. The female worker smiled and told me that the man hadn't worked out or changed his diet at all. What shocked me even more was when she told me that his eating habits had become worse, and yet he still had what I considered the ideal male physique. The woman told me the machine was a device that helped suppress the weight of the patients in the facility. I didn't have to hear anything else. It was unintelligent of me to not ask any other questions. Yet that fantasy, my old body, maybe even one that was better than before, it sounded wonderful. The worker opened the door, and we went down the hall and into a room through a pair of yellow and metallic doors. There was a chair and a metal table off to the right. There, the device sat. I also took notice of a brown door connected to the room. It didn't matter then. All I wanted was the damn weight to go away. The woman asked for me to remove my shirt, and she sat me down in the chair and began to set up the device. She hooked up the belt from the machine around my waist. I closed my eyes and began to cry a little. This had to work. Earlier, I had thought about stopping my vehicle and go back home and forget the entire program. For all I knew, they could have just been a group of scammers that wanted to harvest my organs. No, I needed this. This fantasy had to become true. If I opened my eyes a little quicker, I would have noticed the woman pointing a syringe towards my neck. I had woken up in a dazed state. The lights had been on in the large room, and yet my surroundings weren't the first thing I noticed. The aroma stung my nostrils. It was like I had been thrown into a non-working trash compactor. No crushing at all, only the smell of waste. I retched so hard that I felt a migraine coming along. That's when I saw the other patients. From all around, there were several men and women, all of different ages. They were strapped down in metallic chairs. They too had been wearing the same contraption I had around my waist. Their weight had grown far beyond from what a living person could take. Incisions had been made just above their hips, and those tubes from the machines had been forced within the cuts. A fluid of yellow, red, and brown was being sucked out of their bodies and disposed from within the belt-like machine, then down holes embedded in the ground in front of their seats. There had also been metal buckets placed below their exposed buttocks. That's when I realized the smell had not been garbage and waste, but excrement. Some of patients' bodies hadn't been heavy at all. Loose skin from their faces and limbs hung below the chairs, and it continued on a bit before stopping at their shoes. On the other end of the room, there was that same brown door. Nurses came in and out carrying large trays of fast food, desserts, and several packs of soda cans. The first thing I thought would happen was that the patients would knock the food out of the workers' hands and use the remaining energy they had to break out of their prison. Instead, they only looked up at the nurses without saying anything and began to grab at the food before stuffing it into their mouths and barely chewing. There had been that vacuum sound, the one that I heard beyond the walls from earlier. The machines had turned on, and the suction of the tubes began. Groans echoed throughout the room. I heard someone to the right throw their head forward and vomit. I looked down at my body. Like everyone else, incisions had been made just above my hips where those tubes had been placed. These people, the owners of those dust-covered vehicles, they didn't seem like they wanted to leave. Had they been here for months, stuffing their faces, having these meals and fat pumped out of their body after it hit their stomachs? I pictured my future, the despair of my mom as she wondered where I had gone. Even if she found my car outside this building in the future, it would be too late for when she came back with a bunch of armed policemen. Would she find my body, either heavier than she had ever seen me or any other human, or twig-thin with all my excess skin hanging all the way to the floor? What if I too accepted this life and decided to enjoy the rubbish these workers would continue to feed me until my heart would give out? It's sad to note that most of these things later happened. Months later, my mom had tracked down the location, and the building had been swarmed to the brim with a SWAT team and cruisers. They had found my body near death, frail with loose skin that stretched on. Although all of this happened so long ago, I still can't think about it without wanting to burst into tears. I've been a part of a rehabilitation center for a while now. After everything that I went through, my body will never become the ideal figure that I've always wanted to have. Writing all of this down helped a little, thankfully. I might show it all to my psychologist tomorrow morning. If I did indeed present it to them, I'll probably post this online as well. If anyone on Reddit or Facebook is reading this right now, I hope that you can all look past the grotesque aspect of my life story. If any of you have been struggling with weight insecurities, I hope that you'll be kinder to yourselves. Don't let it drag you down. If you do want to get into better shape, I shall cheer you on. My mom's mental health has been improving since then, and if I'm lucky enough, I can come back home and start up community college again. The next thing I'm hoping to work on is letting go of that facility. Despite all the pain I went through, I sometimes have this urge to look up that website and find another location. Story 7. I woke up buried alive. 3 nights ago. That's when all of this started. We were on a night out in the nearby town, celebrating one of my friend's birthdays. Me, Emily, Dan and the birthday girl, Claire. We'd been out for hours, moving from bar to bar before settling in our favorite club. The drinks were flowing, the music was blaring, we were dancing, and just having a good time in general. Although my memory of it is a little hazy now, I know it was a great night. There was only one low point that stood out. It was only a little thing, but I'd gotten into a bit of an altercation with someone at one of the bars. Claire was on the dance floor, just vibing to the music, when this drunken idiot wandered over and started giving her some clearly unwanted attention. I could see in Claire's eyes as she stared at me from across the bar while trying to get away from that creep that she was uncomfortable. So I stepped in, positioning myself between Claire and the drunk. He threatened me, waving a finger in my face and calling me every name under the sun. When I didn't budge, he even went as far as to try and take a swing at me. Thankfully, this was relatively early on in the night and I wasn't too drunk, which was more than I could say for him. His fist went wide, missing its mark completely. I shoved him in retaliation, sending him reeling backwards as he attempted to haphazardly regain his balance. Finally catching himself, he went to make his way back over to me, fire burning in his eyes before his friends grabbed him and dragged him away. The air was filled with shouts of, "Leave it, mate. It's not worth it. And come on, man. Let's go," as he was led from the bar out into the street. All the while his eyes were locked on me, staring daggers. Above the shouts of his friends, I could hear him yelling in a slurred voice, "You'll regret that, mate. You don't know who you're messing with." Not paying it any mind. The guy was clearly off his face. I turned back to check on Claire. She was obviously shaken by the whole thing, but was ultimately glad that he was gone. We all tried our best to put that incident to the back of our minds, and after a few more drinks, we were back to it, getting on with having a great night. Eventually, at around 1 a.m. I think, we called it a night. The bars were all closed. The crowd in the club had started to trickle down, and with us all now being in our 30s, none of us had the stamina to stay out much later. After waiting for what felt like an age in the cold of the taxi rank, we clambered into the first free one and made our way back home. Claire, Emily and Dan all lived on the edge of town, each departing the taxi one after the other and paying their fee, before the driver set off towards the countryside, back to my house. I'd only recently moved into it. It was a lovely old farmhouse just outside of town, surrounded by fields. I'd always loved the idea of living in the country, but in situations like this, it was a bit of a hindrance as it meant I'd need to pay more for my ride. Still, nothing beats waking up to the view of rolling fields and lush woods each morning. Pulling to a stop in my driveway, I paid the driver and stumbled out of the car. Staggering across the path towards my front door, I mumbled a drunken thanks over my shoulder. I'd not felt too bad in the taxi, but the cool night air made me realize exactly how drunk I actually was. My vision was swimming as I made my way along the dark path, and my legs threatened to give way at any second. Behind me, I heard the crunch of tires on gravel as the taxi pulled away, leaving me alone in front of my home. Meandering along to the front door, I leaned against it, allowing it to take my weight as I fumbled with the key. My hands seemed to experience a delay, taking a few seconds to respond to my commands, which made putting the small key in the small lock an arduous task. Eventually, after a couple of failed attempts, I heard the familiar sound of sliding metal as the key finally slid in and the lock released with a click. Clumsily pushing the door open, I staggered inside. The house was dark, and something about the stillness of it all made a twinge of discomfort crawl along my back. I'd not long moved in. I'd only got the keys a couple of weeks ago, and even then, it took me another week to finally move everything in properly, so it still didn't quite feel like home. Closing the door behind me, I fumbled the key in the lock again before bumbling along the darkened hallway, clambering up the stairs on all fours. I dragged myself to my bedroom, not even bothering to change out of my clothes before flopping down and passing out on the bed. I don't know how long I'd been asleep for. It felt like hardly any time at all, when a blinding bright light pierced my eyes, snapping me awake. I blinked frantically, squinting hard against the sting in my retina. It took several seconds for my eyes to adjust to the bright light. My head was fuzzy, my vision still swimming slightly with the remnants of drunkenness still not quite having worked their way out of my system. The light pounding in my temples brought with it the threat of the impending hangover I knew was on its way. As though nothing more than a dream, the events of last night slowly started coming back to me, most of them anyway, but something didn't feel right. I was still fully clothed, but it was freezing. I didn't recognize what I was seeing as my still slightly drunk brain tried to catch up with my eyes. I was lying flat on my front, just as I had been when I passed out, only rather than the soft covers of my bed and pillow, something soft and green seemed to be tickling my nose and the side of my face. The bright light seemed to shrink back as my eyes finally focused, revealing what looked like blades of grass reaching towards me. With a great effort, I raised my head, the pounding in my temples intensifying. It was grass, surrounding me on all sides. The blades flattened where I'd been lying on them. Some of them had stuck to my face. I pushed myself up into a sitting position, taking in my surroundings as my confusion grew. I was outside. I'd been lying face first on my front lawn for I don't know how long, long enough to leave a distinct imprint in the grass. The bright light that broke through the overcast sky above me had roused me from sleep. How long had I been out here? I could see my house just ahead of me. Behind me was the road bordering my property and the woods on the other side. Further off to my left was the fence leading off to my neighbor, Bart Penton's property in the distance. How had I gotten out here? I know I was drunk last night, and although it was hazy, I could remember climbing the staircase to bed. Unless I was that drunk I'd just passed out on the front lawn just after the taxi left. Maybe I'd dreamt of actually going to bed. Embarrassment burned at my cheeks just thinking about it. I'd never done anything like this before. Sure, I'd drank so much that I passed out before, mainly when I was a teenager, but that had always been at my house or a friend's house. I'd always managed to make it back inside at the very least. I thanked my lucky stars that I wasn't still living in my old house. I had no idea what I would have said to the neighbors. Thankfully, as this house was in the country, and although there wasn't a huge amount of land separating it from the nearest dwelling, there was still more than enough to prevent Bart from noticing my awkward sleeping arrangement. Forcing myself to my feet, still staggering a little, I brushed off the stray blades of grass. My head was pounding harder now that I was supporting my own weight, and I knew the hangover would soon be upon me in full force. I needed to get inside and get a coffee, a shower, and some paracetamol. Stumbling back to the front door, my joints aching from resting on such an uncomfortable surface for such a long time. I tried my key in the lock, twisting it to unlock the door. The key didn't budge. Raising an eyebrow in confusion, I tried again, twisting a little harder this time. The key still wouldn't move, a firm resistance pressing against it. Now even more confused, I reached for the handle, turning it. The door opened smoothly, leading to the hallway within, illuminated only by the morning sunlight. Surely if I'd dreamt going to bed, I wouldn't have unlocked the door. Perplexed, the only thing I could think was that I must have made it to the door and unlocked it last night before passing out. But then, why I would have chosen to go back out onto the lawn and pass out, rather than just open the door and go into the house, was beyond me. Trying to pick apart my drunken thoughts would have been an exercise in futility. With my hangover now ramping up in intensity, the allure of coffee and painkillers became too hard to resist. I made my way inside, closing the door behind me, and tried to forget about last night's embarrassment. I went about the rest of my day, albeit with a subdued attitude that comes with being hungover. The rest of the day came and went uneventfully, although my thoughts kept on drifting back to how I'd woken up that morning. I couldn't believe it. I was in my 30s. That was something you'd have expected from a teenager, not a fully grown adult. The pounding in my head seemed determined not to give up, and I began to dread that it might be a 2-day hangover. I'd only experienced them a couple of times, but each time I remembered wanting to die. In an attempt to speed up my recovery, I went to bed earlier that evening, the sun barely even sinking below the horizon before I crawled under my covers. Thankfully, sleep came quickly, likely due to the restless sleep I must have endured last night face down on the lawn. Before I knew it, my eyelids were closed and I was fast away, waking with a start. A bright light pierced my eyes, burning away the vestiges of rest. Much like yesterday, I had no idea how long I'd been asleep for, but the light seemed too bright to be seeping in through my curtains. Squinting to avoid the stinging of the light, blurred shapes slowly came into focus. A cool chill worked its way along my spine as my eyes registered my surroundings. I was lying face down again, the light from above me beating down and illuminating the area. The hard surface beneath me was a dull brown, not like the soft blue of my bed covers, or even the lush green of my front lawn. Around me, I could see piles of browning leaves, brushed away into small piles to reveal the snaking of thick tree roots worming their way through the floor. Thick trunks were visible just beyond them, reaching upwards towards the clear sky, their canopy obscuring the sunlight slightly. Flabbergasted, I pushed myself into a sitting position and scanned around, not quite believing what I was seeing. I was outside again! How the hell was I outside again? I'd not passed out this time. There was no way I'd dreamt of going to bed. Everywhere I looked, large, old trees seemed to loom over me, pressing in around me almost menacingly. I shivered, realizing just how cold I actually was. God knows how long I'd been lying there in the dirt in nothing by my pajamas, the ground chill working its icy fingers through me. Panic set in as my eyes darted around wildly. Where was I? Everywhere looked the same. I was obviously in some kind of woods. But how had I gotten here? Trying to regain control of my slowly spiraling thoughts. I got to my feet, looking for anything that might help me. Trying to think logically, the only thing that came to mind was that I must have sleepwalked. I vividly remembered going to bed last night, so the only explanation for waking up in the woods was that I'd walked out here in my sleep. I'd never sleepwalked before, even as a child, but it was the only thing that made any semblance of sense. And if I had sleepwalked, the only forest within walking distance was the woods outside my house. Scanning around again for anything familiar, hope soared in me as I made out the bough of a large oak tree in the distance, split down the middle by a lightning strike several years before. It was heavily obscured by the thick trunks of several other trees. A good distance away from me, I remembered seeing that tree from my bedroom window, almost on the horizon. I must have walked for ages. With a landmark to work with, I began to feel a little better, at least now knowing the direction I needed to go. I needed to get home. I was freezing, and my feet were stinging from the uncomfortable bumps and jabs from the roots beneath them. I turned away from the tree, about to make my way through the dense woods back towards my house, when I stopped dead. Looking at the ground beneath me, I'd not really paid much attention to it before, but there were marks in the dirt, the obvious, sweeping indentations of fingers being dragged along, congregating the piles of leaves at the edge of this small clearing. Had I cleared the area to make a bed for myself? As I stared at them, confused, another shape caught my eye and the blood drained from my face. It was difficult to see, obscured and broken by the roots that coated the floor, but I swear I could see what looked like the imprint of a boot in the dirt, staring down at my own feet. They were bare. Had someone else been here? No, that was crazy. I lived on my own out in the sticks. The only person nearby would be Bart, and why would he be out here? Heck, at his age I doubt he'd have even been able to walk to my house, let alone this deep into the woods. Something didn't feel right about this. I looked around again, calling out, half expecting a figure to emerge from behind one of the trees. The thick woods seemed leering and oppressive now, as though the canopy above me was slowly closing in, clothed in only my pajamas, without so much as a pair of shoes. I suddenly became aware of how vulnerable I was. With no one else for miles around and me defenseless like this, if someone had dragged me out here to do God knows what, then no one would know, and there would be no one to help me. Averting my gaze from the boot print, I made my way through the still woods, picking up as much speed as my protesting feet would allow. I needed to get home. Dried leaves and concealed twigs stabbed at my soles as I crushed them underfoot. I ignored the pain as best as I could. I just wanted to get home. After what felt like hours of walking, I could finally see it, obscured by the tree line. The shape of my house bolstered my resolve, and I charged on, bursting from the woods and out onto the road. I'd never been so relieved to feel solid tarmac beneath my feet before. Rushing across it and onto the soft grass of my front lawn, all I could think of was getting inside where it was safe. I charged across my front lawn, climbing the front steps two at a time, reaching my hand out for the handle, relief filling me knowing that I was so close now. But that relief was short-lived. As I reached the top of the steps, I stopped dead in my tracks. The door was ajar. I knew it must have just been me, that if I'd sleepwalked out into the woods, then I'd have had to unlock the door to get out. But I couldn't shake the image of the boot print I'd seen. What if someone had been there? What if they'd come back here after leaving me in the woods? I knew it was a stupid thought. That boot print could have been there for who knows how long. But I couldn't get it out of my head. Gingerly pushing the door open, the dim hallway came into view. Where it had once felt cozy and inviting, it now seemed to have taken on a more hostile demeanor, the light exaggerating the shadows. It was as though this was a place where I was no longer welcome. A strange feeling washed over me, almost one of violation at the idea that someone might have been in here without me knowing, working their way through my house while I slept, before dragging me out into those woods for who knows what reason. Quietly, I slipped inside, my senses keen to any kind of sound, half expecting to catch a subtle movement from the corner of my eye. Slowly and quietly I made my way to the kitchen, all the while my eyes were darting from side to side. I was unarmed and in my pajamas, although the idea of someone being in my house was almost far-fetched. The oppressive energy that bombarded me caused the hairs on my neck to stand on end. If someone had dragged me out into the woods and returned here, then I at least wanted to be able to defend myself. Scooping up a knife from the block in the kitchen, I shakily made my way around as quietly as I could, moving carefully from room to room, tentatively peering around doors and checking even the smallest cupboards for any sign of disturbance. Thankfully, the ground floor was empty. Everything was as I'd left it the night before. Gingerly climbing the stairs, I winced as they screeched under my weight. I'd not lived here that long, so I couldn't remember which of the old steps creaked. If there was anyone here, they would have certainly heard that. Ascending to the landing, I decided there was no use in trying to be stealthy anymore. Not after the stairs had given my presence away. I shouted into the silence of the house, urging anyone up there to come out now, and that I was armed. My heartbeat was pounding in my ears as I stood there, dreading what might come next. After several painful seconds of silence, I knew that if there was someone up here, they weren't going to come out willingly. Gripping the knife tighter, I started to make my way into each of the upstairs rooms, bursting through the doors so as not to give a potential intruder time to act. Each of the rooms seemed as empty as I'd left them the previous night. Boxes of my possessions were piled up in the spare room as I'd left them. The bathroom was untouched, and my bedroom was just the same as it always had been, the covers disturbed from where I must have gotten out of bed the night before. I searched them all thoroughly, scouring them from top to bottom, looking for anywhere that anyone could feasibly hide. There was nothing. They were each as empty and deserted as the last. There was no one else in the house. Just me, here, alone. Still, even with that knowledge, I couldn't relax. If there was no one here, then I must have sleepwalked out into the woods last night. It was a miracle I'd not injured myself or made myself sick from exposure, now that we were headed towards winter. Being outside all night in my pajamas was a surefire way of freezing to death. Sheepishly returning the knife to the block downstairs, I proceeded to shower in an attempt to warm myself up again, getting changed into some fresh clothes. I made myself some breakfast and tried my best to distract myself from my whirling thoughts. Ultimately, it was futile. Every little noise from the old wood of the house settling caused me to jump with a start. The feeling of being watched by something just outside of the doorway set me on edge, and I would whirl around, expecting to see someone standing there just inches behind me. My mind, deep in its paranoid state, was jumping from thought to thought in an erratic pattern that was making my head spin. I was making connections where there were none, trying to make sense of what was going on. Sleepwalking seemed like the most obvious answer, but as though that wasn't a good enough reason for what was happening, the story the estate agent told me about this place wormed its way to the front of my mind. One of the reasons I bought this place was because of its age. I loved old buildings, the way they still stood strong against the ravages of time. They always had such unique histories, silent sentinels observing the ages marching by. This particular house had been built around 300 years ago, and I was eager to uncover the secrets it held. When asked about the history of the house, the estate agent, a young man in his early 20s called Carl, had relayed some mundane information about the previous owners, the standard facts that they gave to prospective buyers who were only concerned about whether they'd kept it in acceptable condition or not. When Carl saw my nonplussed expression, he must have realized what I was expecting to hear. Glancing around to check that no one would overhear us, he leaned in closer to me, as though discussing something that would land him a prison sentence if he wasn't careful. Okay, look, take this with a pinch of salt, as no one has ever been able to verify it. And I really shouldn't be telling you this, but there's a story about this place. Well, it's more of a local legend, really. But like I said, there's nothing to base it on, so please don't think anything of it. A nervous smile spread across his face as he said that last part, as though worried that by telling me this legend, he'd be jeopardizing his potential sale. I smiled at him in what I hoped was a reassuring way, and nodded, bidding him to continue. He seemed to relax slightly before going on to explain. The legend went that shortly after the house was built, a famine swept the area. One of the previous owners, an old farmer by the name of William Tuck, barely survived, losing his entire family to it, having invested all of his money into the failing farm, and being too frail to venture into town to get aid. There was no way that the old man could get them to the church to bury them. This was before the town was as large as it is now. Even Bart's house had not yet been built, and it was several miles before even the nearest neighbor. The legend went that the old man, stricken by grief and lapsing into madness at surviving his offspring, dragged them out into the woods bordering the property. No one knows how far into those woods he went, but when he came back out, he was alone. They say he buried them out in the woods before trudging back to the house. When his neighbors went to check on him a few weeks later, after no one had heard from him around the town, they found a trail of muddy footprints leading up to the front door, the door itself wide open, and a dirty shovel resting against the outside wall. When they entered the house, the stench hit them, sickly sweet and foul. It was billowing down from the open attic. Old William was hanging from the rafters, his body already heavily in the throes of decay. Again, there is absolutely no proof that any of that really happened. Just local stories, so please don't pay it any mind, Carl said to me, almost immediately regretting humoring me. I'd thought it was an interesting tale at the time, a story that gave the place a bit of character, and as people had lived here since then, there was obviously nothing wrong with it. But now I couldn't help but take it a little more seriously. If the legend was true, could that have perhaps somehow tainted the place? I'd not noticed anything wrong since I moved in. There had been nothing out of the ordinary at all in the week I'd been here. Normally, when you hear people talk about ghosts, they talk about things moving and sounds that go bump in the night, but there had been nothing of any kind. No, I was being stupid. That story was made up, probably by one of the townspeople to drive the price of the house down and scare away any prospective buyers so they could swoop in and get the land for next to nothing. An elaborate legend that spread through the town back then as an entertaining story for bored locals. I was becoming irrational. I needed someone to help ground me. Pulling my phone out of my pocket, I dropped Claire a message on WhatsApp. I'd decided against putting anything in our group chat, as I knew there would be no end to the teasing Dan would decide my story warranted. Claire tended to be a good listener, so I thought she would be my best bet. It didn't take her long to respond, and, much as I'd hoped, her reaction was one of concern rather than mockery. She said that it was probably sleepwalking like I suspected, and that it might be worth me seeing a doctor as well as hiding my front door keys somewhere unusual before I went to bed so that my asleep self couldn't find them. When I mentioned the boot print in the woods when I'd woken up this morning, she agreed that it was odd, but thought much as I did that it was probably an old print from a hiker or something. Yeah, it's probably an old print. Or then again, maybe all this is that creep from the bar the other night trying to mess with you. I didn't understand what she was talking about initially, although it was only a couple of days ago that we went out for her birthday. It felt like a lifetime had passed, and then it came to me. Whatever. That dude was a dick. Besides, he'd have had to have waited outside for what, 6 hours, and then tailed me back to my place, and then broken in and dragged me out into the woods. He didn't seem clever enough for that. Haha, yeah, that arsehole could barely string 2 words together sober. Still, he did say you don't know who you're messing with. He obviously meant he was an expert stalker and cat bugler. It's the only explanation, Claire replied, embellishing the response with a winking emoji. I appreciated her trying to cheer me up. In all the years we'd been friends, she was always the best person to speak to when something was on your mind. She had an innate, caring nature that really shone through. We talked for a little while longer, and I found myself gradually calming down, my thoughts becoming more rational and less scattered. Eventually, as the day went on, the sun sank in the sky, indicating that it was time for bed again, although I was now pretty certain that there had been no one there last night. I completed another precautionary sweep of the house again, just in case. I passed from room to room, my trusty kitchen knife in hand, ready to find someone hiding in a tiny cupboard or something. just waiting for me to go to close my eyes and go to sleep. When I found nothing, I returned the knife and made my way upstairs to my room, getting ready for bed safe, in the knowledge that the house was empty. I propped a chair in front of my bedroom door, hoping that it would be too much of an obstacle for me to overcome if I was asleep, before sliding under my covers. Although the thought of sleepwalking and waking up in those woods again filled me with dread, eventually I found myself slipping into a dreamless sleep. I jolted awake, gasping, the air around me thick and moist. Something heavy pressed down above me from all angles, forcing me flat against the cold surface beneath. The dense pressure above me crushed the wind out of me with each struggling breath. I tried to move my head, to look over my shoulder, but it was held firmly in place. Squashed still, panicked, my wide eyes whirled around in their sockets trying to find the source of the pressure. I couldn't make out a thing, just an inky abyss as far as I could see. I tried to bring my arms up, but the weight pinned them firmly in place. Something cold and solid, like some kind of wall, stopped me from stretching them out at my sides. The only thing I could move was my fingers. As I wiggled each of them, all I could feel was something soft and cold working its way between them like falling sand as I struggled in vain. I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. What the hell was going on? Where was I? What was crushing me? Had I been sleepwalking again and gotten myself stuck somewhere, maybe? I didn't like this. I'd never been good with small spaces and being confined, especially not in the dark. The air felt clammy, stinking of my own hot breath as well as a damp, earthy stench. My breathing quickened, verging on hyperventilating. I wasn't getting any oxygen, although I was breathing fast. My lungs seemed to tighten with each inhale, causing a stinging pain to flare up in my chest. I needed to get out of here, wherever here was. I tried to wriggle my head free from the crushing weight and turn it around. I pushed as hard as I could, straining the muscles in my neck to the point that I thought something was going to tear or burst. But it wouldn't budge. Defeated, I dropped my head back down, my neck sore from the exertion, and felt the cold trickle of something sliding across my face. The moldy stench of earth intensified as something foul-tasting and grainy fell into my mouth. I screamed, or at least tried my best to, that flare in my lungs burning even hotter, causing me to wince in pain. Frantically, I began struggling, flailing my arms and legs against whatever held them, trying my best to move them in the little space they had, pushing myself as hard as I could against the crushing weight above me. I felt that same feeling of cold, slithering sand sliding around me, moving with the desperate thrashing of my body. The air grew hotter as I wrestled for breath, my panicked writhing making my labored breathing even harder. I was suffocating. I didn't know what was going on, but I knew if I didn't get out of there soon, then I was going to die. By some miracle, although I have no idea how, I somehow managed to get my arms underneath my chest, the unrelenting weight seemingly shifting in response to my thrashing. I tensed as hard as I could, shoving my back with all my might against the weight above it, my arms burning with the exertion. Then, a fire of hope ignited within me. I felt the weight above me shift slightly, weakening under my desperate efforts, spluttering from the stuffy, stale air forcing its way into me with each breath, and the searing sensation that accompanied it. The foul, grainy substance spilt down from above me with each push. It was piling around my hands now, like a grainy sea, covering them with its cold, earthy weight. The stench of mold and wet dirt was unbearable. My throat was burning. I needed air! Still, that ray of hope shone through. I forced myself back harder, shoving myself against the weight above me with every last ounce of strength I had. My arms burned and my back ached with the pressure fighting against me. But I had to keep going. I could feel the weight relenting, easing gradually with that trickling feeling, until it finally weakened enough that I was able to force myself backwards with one final effort. All at once the weight slid away, no longer able to hold me down as I broke free from whatever had covered me. Bursting up into a kneeling position, it felt so good to be upright. I felt that trickling feeling working its way down my face and body, slowly falling away as though it was being pulled back into whatever mass I'd just broken free from. It was replaced by the cool movement of a gentle breeze licking at my exposed face and hands, gulping down breath after breath. My lungs burned as the beautiful cold, clean air filled them, but I didn't care. Glaring light stung my eyes as I blinked frantically, trying to make sense of these new surroundings. The sense of hope and elation that came with this new freedom was short-lived, however, as my eyes slowly adjusted. A chill slithered down my spine as the familiar piles of leaves from yesterday came clearly into view. I was in the same clearing that I'd sleepwalked into last night. Looking down, ice filled my veins. Rather than having just fallen asleep on the cold dirt floor like last night, I appeared to be kneeling in what looked to be freshly turned soil. I stared at my arms and legs. They were coated in a thick layer of dirt, as though I'd been rolling around in the stuff. That cold trickling feeling, that weight. It was dirt moving around me, above me, feverishly whirling around. I could see the extent of the hole that I was currently kneeling in, around 2 F deep, most of it covered with fresh soil. It stretched out for around 7 F. Someone had buried me alive. There's no way I could have done this while sleepwalking. No way that I could have dug a hole this deep and somehow buried myself in it all while unconscious. The hair on my neck stood on end as I feverishly scanned around the tree line, expecting to see whoever was responsible standing there, inches away, watching me. The woods were as still and empty as the day before, the trees eerily still despite the breeze in the air. I was alone, or at least as far as I was aware. The canopy above me seemed to leer down oppressively, and that feeling of vulnerability from yesterday morning came crashing down on me again. Although I'd escaped the crushing weight of the dirt burying me alive, I still felt equally as trapped as I had under the soil. Someone was trying to kill me, and when they noticed I'd broken free from my shallow grave, it would be all too easy for them to finish me off. I was defenseless. The sound of my blood aggressively flowing filled my ears with each pounding heartbeat. As I furtively glanced around again, all too aware that I was sitting here, half in the dirt in only my pajamas, my eyes locked onto something on the ground near the edge of the hole that made bile rise in my throat. A boot print, the same boot print as I'd seen yesterday. The same boot print that I'd convinced myself had been left in the clearing ages ago, was now looking back at me from the edge of the hole, embedded in the freshly turned dirt. A bolt of fear shocked its way along my nerves as I stumbled back, away from the print, my mind whirling. Whoever had buried me here had dragged me out here last night too. They'd probably tried to drag me out here the night before that as well, but left me on the lawn for some reason. Maybe they'd been disturbed. But still, they'd somehow broken into my house, dragged me into the woods without waking me, placed me in the hole, and buried me all while I slept, oblivious. How long had they been watching me? How had they gotten in? Dazed by the thoughts writhing around in my head, I felt sick, dragging myself from the hole. My legs barely held my weight as a wave of nausea washed over me. Stumbling as the dirt fell from me, I charged through the woods barefoot, the dead leaves and broken twigs stabbing into the soles of my feet as I crushed them, weaving in and out of the trees. I charged towards the edge of the forest, away from the site of my burial. I needed to get out of here. I needed to get home, to call the police. My ears were pricked, open to the sounds around me, half expecting to hear the crashing of heavy boots gaining on me through the undergrowth. My head was on a swivel, my terrified eyes darting left and right, scrutinizing each tree that I passed, with the expectation of a hooded figure jumping out ready to finish what they'd started. My heart pounded in my ears with each step I took. The searing pain in my feet was screaming at me to stop, to slow down, but all I could think about was getting out of there, getting home where I would be safe. As I got closer to the edge of the woods, the familiar brick of my house slowly became visible through the dense trees. Hope soared within me at the sight, urging me on, faster and faster. I was so nearly there, so nearly safe. Bursting through the tree line and out onto the main road, I stopped dead, my hope crashing and burning as I stared at my home. The front door was open, wide open. along the path leading up to it, and clearly visible on the steps of my porch, were large, muddy boot prints. I didn't need to get any closer to know they were the same boot prints that I'd seen in the woods only a few minutes ago. The boot prints of whoever was doing this to me. Whoever had buried me was in my house. They'd had come back here after they'd finished. For all I knew, they could very well still be there now. A bright reflection stung my eyes as I beheld the sight before me. Dumbfounded, I raised my hand to block it out, my eyes moving to its source. Leaning against the side of the house, as though in a stoic vigil, was an old shovel. Sunlight was reflecting off of one of the screws holding the handle in place, leaving spots in my vision. The blade of the shovel was brown, coated with a layer of fresh dirt, as though it had not long been used. Seeing the shovel resting there, I turned and ran, sprinting along the rough tarmac of the road. I had no idea what was happening, but I knew I couldn't go back inside. The way it had all looked, it was too familiar, too much like the story the estate agent had told me. After racing down the road for a few miles, I managed to make it to Bart's house. The soles of my feet, no longer hurting, were now completely numb. A cocktail of adrenaline and trauma had rendered them unfazed by the coarse road beneath me and the crunching gravel of Bart's driveway. Knocking on the door, he answered, a terrified expression crossing his face as he beheld my current state. He ushered me inside, letting me use his phone, and I called the police. After thoroughly searching my house, the police found nothing to indicate there had been a break-in, nor that anyone was there at all after I'd crawled out of the woods. They couldn't explain the boot prints, nor how the shovel got there, but they said that it could have potentially been something I'd done myself while I was asleep if I'd been sleepwalking. They also told me that I might want to call the RSPCA, as they thought something might have died in my loft. They couldn't find anything up there, but the smell was apparently unbearable. I'm writing this from my friend's computer, as I'm not staying in that house for another night. I need help! I don't know what's happening. I have no idea if this is all that guy from the bar trying to mess with me, although I don't know how he's doing all this, or if this is one of the locals trying to force me out using that story that the estate agent told me. Then again, that story had to have come from somewhere. What if it was real, and that old man is trying to bury me in the woods just like his family? What if whoever's doing this is following me? It's progressively gotten worse the past 3 nights, and don't want to go to sleep anymore. I struggled to get out of that grave this morning. What happens next time if they decide to dig deeper? Story 8. It began with strange looks from the horses. There is an evil in this valley, I know that now. It exists in every stone, every felled tree, and the air we breathe. It is old, following my family from generation to generation, from the first step we took here long ago to right outside my window at this very moment. It is difficult to grasp at first, because it hides from you, but you learn to live with it. You have to, because it never concedes, not an inch, and it is slowly gaining on us. When Dad still walked, he used to take me on hunting trips. Often the snow would be so thick and the air so biting cold that I cried throughout the whole ordeal. Of course, this wasn't ideal when the whole point was to be quiet, at one with nature, awaiting a very precise moment. He usually told me as much. "Ain't much room for people like us anymore," he said one particular morning. A layer of freshly fallen snow covered the ground and glittered in the sunlight. The lightest chirps could be heard all around us if you listened. I laid prone with my dad right beside me, perched at the top of a hill overlooking a field below. He held the rifle, and I the binoculars, though it wasn't cold, weirdly. This brand of winter I could endure. "Ain't much money in what we do either," he said. "Don't know how much time we've got left. You've got to enjoy it, son." When he started groveling like that, I turned my ears away. As a child, I didn't comprehend our situation fully, but he was right. There isn't much, if any, money in ranching. At best, you break even. At worst, you ringbark your family tree. However, he always tells me to forget all that money is and do it for the love of it. for the freedom of always getting to choose, for the horses, for the cattle, for the family, and for the valley. Remember, squeeze softly. Do it when you exhale, he said, handing me the weapon. We'd spotted a doe jumping through the field. I have always thought they look too big to bounce like they do. It is almost like they're filled to the brim with helium. Wondrous creatures. It is amazing what you can see when you look, when you notice details. I had shot a gun thrice up until that point. The only difference between those times and that time was the target. Gone was the empty jerry can. Now the barrel was pointed at one of God's creations. That is, if he even exists. Somehow I doubt that nowadays. We were raised Catholic, but ever since I took over the ranch, I've been drifting towards the spiritual, the religion of the land. That is the only belief I have received any sort of tangible evidence for. Still, I was a bit nervous, I recall. I think I even shuddered a little with every breath my tiny lungs produced. I aimed the gun, gently guiding the crosshair, placing it over the animal. I inhaled. Time seemed to stop, then... Wait. Quiet, Dad whispered, looking at something through the binoculars. I am quiet. He hushed me with vigor. Not the time to be annoying, I guessed. He pointed at something in the distance by some pine at the foot of the mountain. It was far away, yet seemed aware of us. It was another deer. And it stood there. Yes, stood. The thing stood on its fucking hind legs. It didn't lean against a tree, in which case it would have been slightly less unsettling, nor did it try to reach for some high-up leaves. It just stood there. My dad started getting agitated, and soon he looked just as nervous as I was. After what seemed like an impossible amount of the time, the deer turned around, still on two legs, and walked off into the forest. I couldn't place what made its movements so bizarre back then, but I can now. It walked like a human. The knees bent the wrong way. We should go back home now, my dad said. Mommy wouldn't want us to miss supper. That was the first time I encountered one of them, but it wasn't the last. That's why I'm writing this. Things have escalated these last couple of weeks. They are learning faster than before. I do not know how much longer I can pick them out, and then I can no longer protect us. I think one of them is inside the house right now, but I can't be sure. Sorry, I'll deal with that when it comes to it. Let me tell you the rest. Time passed, and suddenly I found myself in the position of patriarch. Dad wanted to retire, or at least he thought so. He kept working the stables and breaking horses until he no longer could. Good man. When I took over, we stopped focusing on cattle production. In the modern world, you have to be a large corporation to make that type of venture profitable. So what do you do as a small family-owned ranch? You focus on quality, that's what you do. And that is where the horses enter the equation. You invest in a reputable stallion, feed him, keep him happy and healthy. We only bought the finest hay, burning through our savings fast. Why do the horses need that fancy stuff? Dad asked one night. They do not need it, but the buyers need to know we feed it to them, I replied. Old man had a point. It was a risky play, but turns out it would work out in the end. We bred that first stallion, Speedy Newton II, over and over again. Soon, we had quite the roster on our hands, and we always made sure to market our horses well. We became famous in the world of equestrian sports, and it became sort of a status symbol to own one of our full-bloods. That is how we modernized the business, with a strategy similar to what Apple did back in the early 21st century. Luxury goods, basically. And it made us rich, or at least it took us out of destitution. For the first time ever, we could afford to hire some cowboys, build a bunkhouse, and further push our margins into the green. That has been our reality for the last decade or so, and we now have horses all over the world. I do not intend to dox myself here. Not for fear of what you might do to me, mind you, it's just better if you can't find this land. But we are one of the top-ranked stables in the world at the moment of writing. Last month the first domino fell. Me and a couple of day workers were cleaning the stalls in the stable. It was a tight-knit group of people, and I had the greatest time just chatting with them, tugging their chain a little. I think we were talking about the Tigers game when I noticed something in the corner of my eye. Newton was staring at me, and it wasn't the usual empty-minded horse stare. It had intent, or malice even. His skin was pulled a little too tight around the eyes, and it looked just a little bit too perfect. I had known that horse for the better part of 2 decades, and this wasn't him. And after a while, I swear to God, he licked his lips. The long tongue of a horse. I felt so creeped out by the fact that I decided not to tell any of the cowboys about it. They were a superstitial kind, no need for any extra friction in the bunkhouse. After we wrapped up, I started making my way back to the house. During that walk, it struck me that something else was off about Newton. The eyes. Despite the outwardly likeness between a horse's eye and a human's, they are quite different, especially in context. And he had stared at me with human eyes. I went back to the stable to make sure my mind wasn't playing tricks on me, despite the growing anxiety I felt. When I turned on the lights, he was nowhere to be found, our most prized possession, gone in an instant. A cowboy found his skin later that week, hanging from a branch deep in the forest. Dad knew, I knew, but we didn't tell the workers that. To them, this was the doing of rivaling ranches or thrill seekers or whatever, so they remained calm, but in the main residence, behind closed doors, unrest grew. I had told my dad about the encounter in the stable, and we came to the only logical conclusion. It wasn't like that deer all those years ago. No, they were adapting, learning, becoming a threat. They were getting closer. No, they are close now, I can feel it. I am writing this from my beloved rocking chair. It is very dark here currently. Everybody is sleeping, and for reasons that will become clear later, everybody means a lot of people. Just a moment ago, a shadow moved silently in the dark towards the bathroom. I'm not completely sure it was him, but it almost looked like the silhouette of my dad, walking. I didn't call out to him. 3 weeks ago, we had a nightly visitor. Me and my wife sat curled up on our couch under a blanket. The soft glow of the TV casted dancing lights around the room. Some of those hit our kids, others Mom and Dad. The evening news droned on in the background, and we waited patiently for the movie to resume. The house was still, in a sense. The only sounds were the rustling of pillows and the occasional creak of old wood settling. A sudden knock on the door changed that. I glanced at the clock. 10:37 p.m. Odd time for visitors, huh? Mom said. Yeah. Kids. Follow Mommy and Grammy upstairs, Dad added. It's bedtime, guys, I said, giving them both a kiss on the cheek. Nighty. They had barely made it halfway up when the knocking began anew, this time more aggressive. I peered out the window next to the front door. There was a figure standing out on the porch, cloaked in the dim light of a lantern outside. He looked almost ordinary, dressed in a worn flannel shirt and jeans. Maybe a drifter or trucker down on his luck, I thought, but there was something off about the way he stood, too still, too deliberate. I unlocked the door and cracked it open slightly, making sure to keep the chain on. "Can I help you?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. The man smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Sorry to bother you, sir. My car broke down around the bend and my phone's dead. Could I borrow yours to call for help?" "Where's your car?" I remember asking, thinking that the sooner I helped him, the sooner he'd be gone. "Just over there," he said, pointing vaguely into the darkness. No car. Strange. I must have walked farther than I thought. His request seemed reasonable enough, yet something felt wrong. There was an imminent danger. I knew it. His eyes, dark, seemed to bore into me, and his smile never wavered. "Just a minute, buddy." I closed the door and went to retrieve my phone. While on the move, I grabbed one of the rifles hanging on the wall and handed it to my dad. Even though he was wheelchair-bound, he was still apt with a gun in his hands. When I started making my way back to the door, I saw the handle start shaking. I ran to open it. "Hey man, take it easy." My voice faltered a bit. He didn't say anything, so I just handed him the phone. The man stepped forward, and as he did, the light from the hallway illuminated his face more clearly. His skin, though human-like, seemed too tight, almost as if it was stretched over something not quite the right shape. There was a slight, unnatural sheen to it, like newt. "Thank you," he said, his voice a touch too practiced. As he dialed, he glanced at me, eyes flickering over my face, studying me. I felt an instinctive urge to back away. The air around him felt charged, oppressive. "Got through," he said, handing the phone back. "Help's on the way." I nodded. "Good. That's good. Mind if I wait inside? It's pretty cold out here." It was cold indeed. I noticed my breath fog in the night air, but his remained clear, unaffected. At that moment, I remember wishing that my dad would take charge, like he used to when I was a kid. Maybe just shoot the guy, but this was my responsibility now. "I'm sorry," I said, trying to keep my voice firm. "I can't let you in. You can wait on the porch if you'd like." His smile faltered for just a moment, a flicker of something dark passing over his expression. "Of course." I started closing the door, but he put his foot down before I could react. His eyes looked crazed, more like a deer's than a human's, and the fingers he put around the doorframe were crooked, bent in subtly awful angles. "You got kids in there?" he said, this time with a tinge of desperation. "No, but I do have a gun." The man noticed my father. He took a long look at him. His smile started creeping back, and he calmed down yet again. He combed his hair with his hands. "I'll just wait out here, thank you." I slammed the door shut, locking it, engaging the second chain. Through the window, I watched as he tried the door a couple more times. Then he stood there far too still, for far too long. Finally, he turned and walked off into the night, his movements too fluid, too alien. It all left an indelible mark of dread. "Good job, son," Dad said, letting silence do most of the talking. "Forgive me if I got some of the details wrong. I was more scared than I've ever been before. This isn't your typical boogeyman or even a murderer we're talking about here. This is something that can and will take the skin of your loved ones just to get to you. An evil unmatched by anything that has ever visited me in my nightmares. Now, there are tales about them, stories that have existed ever since people first stepped foot on the continent. Hushed words spoken around midnight campfires. You aren't supposed to let them hear you talking about them. That is an invitation. When they're far away, they sound close. When they're close, they sound far away. That sort of thing. Nothing about how you protect yourself from them, though. The worst encounters are always the quiet ones. Earlier today, I saw one through the window on the second floor. He was standing halfway behind a tree. I don't know if it thought it was hidden or if it was toying with me. It was eerie. He had a very normal-looking suit on, except it was dirty and ridden with holes, and he reminded me of someone. Sometimes I catch myself wondering if they take the clothes too. How does it even work? Do they skin their victims and dress themselves physically? Is it metaphysical in some manner, spiritual perhaps? Do they just morph into their desired form? Either way, it requires a dead body. Maybe the rest of the details are unnecessary. Details. They are crucial now. Before, you could spot them from far away. They'd take over an animal and not know how it walked, how it sounded. Sometimes you could even hear them practice. They make a bone-chilling noise, like a mix between the desperate, dying shriek of an elk and the rageful war cry of an adult man. Now, apparently they can talk just like us. Details. The devil lies in them. On the floor in front of me, all the cowboys are spread out on mattresses. Some are snoring, some are restlessly rolling around in their sleep. My family is here too. Everybody is gathered under the same roof. Figured it was safer that way. We have a system of delegating guard duties. We do 2 hours at a time. After what happened last week, there is no room for error anymore. I just hope that I didn't invite the enemy into my home. During supper earlier tonight, one of the cowboys looked at me in a strange manner. but it wasn't the same look I have seen them dish out before. This was more of a curious expression. The only weird part was the duration of it, but maybe he's just confused and scared. I know I am. Now, where was I? Last week, tragedy struck. I'll give you the recap. We were down by the lake repairing a fence. Me and 4 day workers. John, Edgar, Harold, and Ringer. I do not know his real name. Call me a horrible boss if you want, but such is the case with day workers. I call them what the other cowboys call them. Anyhow, the nickname had a double meaning. Firstly, he was an old boxer. Apparently, he was quite good too. Secondly, he had a tough life up until that point. He had been put through the ringer in both senses of the word. Born addicted to some drug, lived with an alcoholic father who later decided to end the life of Ringer's biological mother, and bounced around from job to job during his whole adult life. I'm guessing you know where this is going. Why else describe him in so much detail? Details. I missed one that day. The thing with trying to protect your employees through secrecy is that they can't protect themselves without me. It makes sense. How can you protect yourself from a danger you don't even know exists? I take full and utter responsibility for the incident, and I'm heartbroken about it. The sun was shining on us. The grass was a type of green you don't see very often. All in all, a perfect day to do some fence maintenance. This is quintessential work on a ranch. Everybody knows how to do it. So it sort of becomes automatic at some point. We were all sitting spread out on the fence line, doing our tasks in silence, taking in the serenity of the scene. Ringer sat next to me, maybe a couple of yards away. We all heard the whisper at the same time. It sounded like it came just from the other side of the fence. It was so close, so damn close. I told everybody to stay put. This wasn't a sound you should explore. Ringer, being the good-hearted man that he was, didn't listen. He crouched beneath the barbed wire and made his way over to the closest bush. I followed anxiously. He slowly separated the foliage with his hands. My heart was beating fast. I could sense the nervousness of the other cowboys, even if they had no idea what they had to be nervous about. And then, nothing. I let out a sigh of relief. We're all good. Probably just, He was interrupted by a noise. The very same noise I described earlier. A distant, primal roar. In a second it was over. Something impossibly fast had grabbed him in a drive-by. I didn't fully register what it was, but it looked like a naked man hopping on all fours. I made the mistake of trying to pull him away, something that resulted in me being flung into the fencing. The pain of being wrapped in barbed wire, let me tell you, is something not even whiskey will fix. But yeah, he was gone, disappeared into the forest, put through the ringer one last time. Now that I think about it again, I think that was why I recognized the man in the suit. He kind of looked like Ringer. Fuck, man. They are toying with us. I can feel the effects of it too. I'm paranoid. I see patterns that may not be there. As I sit here, I've compiled a list of all the times this last week that someone has been isolated from the group. I've interviewed everyone, noting their schedules, even my own family. Every odd tick, every weird phrasing, and every strange look is documented in a small leather-bound book I keep here by my side. During the break in paragraphs, I went to check the house. When I got to the basement, I found a small puddle of blood on the floor in the dark. I think this confirms my morbid suspicion. They're inside. But who? I can't figure it out. At least not for sure. And I can't just walk up to someone and shoot them in their sleep. Right? What if I'm wrong? No. I wait for their next move. Hopefully, when dawn comes, we're all still here and human, but I fear that the night may bring horrors. Massacre. We'll see in the morning. Story 9. If she likes you, then you're in. I was perplexed. I'd been recommended by Charles and Dave, high members of long-standing honor. No member voted against me. I had memorized and recited all 13 paragraphs of the lodge's charter and bylaws. I had even endured some unofficial hazing, some more humiliating than others. But who am I to question the process? I was almost there, almost a member of something prestigious and ancient. Whoever she was, I hoped I had enough charm to gain acceptance. Nolan saw the consternation in my demeanor. "Don't worry. After this, you're one of us." He flipped his hood over his head and led the rest of the elders out of the room. A train of high-minded, high-classed men wearing scarlet robes paraded past me, looking solemnly down to the ground. I could not get out of my chair and leave the room until the elders had left the building. I could not turn or look behind me. I had to wait until I heard the door shut, and then quietly recite the incantation of reconciliation. In the water is birth and life. The sacramental candles in abyss immersed. In the water is fear and death. The two is one. The choice be made. Make me worthy and blessed to be saved. After the heavy iron door slammed shut, I recited the incantation 12 times, and after each time I crossed myself, if you could call it that, not by making the sign of the cross, but with hand gestures to symbolize the signs of the zodiac, gestures which only 2 days before I had to memorize and demonstrate before the elders. The incantation was odd to me. Unlike everything else I had experienced as a novice, the crux of it all was this was just for fun. Entertainment, a chance to hang out with some influential people. I didn't approach the rituals with any kind of sincerity. They were innocuous and almost childish. On the other hand, the incantation felt serious, religious, and foreboding. The elders did not tolerate anything but a strict formality to the incantation and its recitation. Eyes straight ahead. Don't look to the left or to the right. Deliberate breathing, deep and slow, Dave would demand when first preparing me to properly recite the incantation. When I had finished, I stood up and collapsed to the floor. My left leg, useless, tingling from a blockage of blood. Damn, my leg's asleep, I murmured to myself. No. The door opened. Dave rushed in and grabbed me under my armpits, lifted me up, and dumped me back in the chair. Now you have to start over again, and when you're finished, you leave the room quietly, not saying a word or a sound. You leave with piety in mind. I watched as he left the room and closed the door. I noticed that he was dressed in casual attire, blue jeans and work boots, uncloaked of his ceremonial robes. I repeated the ritual and made sure to leave the room with the utmost respect. I felt watched, eyes looking scathingly at my behavior, grading my intentions. I drove home with no knowledge of what was to come next. All I got was that cryptic message that if she liked me, then I was in. Who was she? Was that symbolic talk? I didn't know. Neither did I have any idea of when I would see the elders again to know of their decision. They simply told me that they would be in touch. Sleep that night was sporadic, to say the least. I didn't like how Dave manhandled me like I was a child. It felt outside the bounds of the ceremony. It felt personal. There was a disgust in his voice and mannerisms. I was having second thoughts about joining the lodge, especially if I was going to have to be around him all the time. There was a realization that I had never liked Dave, as an acquaintance in high school or as a fellow employee working for the sheriff's office. Finally, after struggling to flush hateful thoughts of Dave from my mind, I fell asleep. It must have been a deep sleep, or perhaps I was drugged, because when I woke up, I was in the back of a moving van, stripped down to my underwear, with my hands tied behind my back and my ankles bound by an electrical cord. There was a bandana tied tightly around my mouth. 3 people were sitting around me, dressed all in black with black ski masks pulled over their faces. The van came to a sudden stop. One of the men, sliding forward, hit his head on the sidewall. Shit. Damn. What the hell? I recognized Dave's voice. My fear somewhat subsided, thinking this was just the final ceremony, but the viciousness of it all made me suspicious. I waffled between relief and stress. This was Dave's doing, not a ceremony. I started to doubt his intentions. Maybe he was angry at my disrespect. No, this was just a part of the act, the final rigmarole to suffer acceptance. The rear van doors opened. Outside there was a faint early morning light. The men, which I had surmised were in fact some of the elders, grabbed me by my ankles and yanked me out of the van and let me fall to the ground. My elbow landed against a large, jagged rock. A stinging sensation jolted up through my forearm. Blood dripped from my elbow to the rock, pooling in a depression on the surface. How quick I bleed out. I thought to myself, be careful. You gave him too much. Are you a doctor? The other man shook his head. No. Then, shut up. Both of you shut up. This is sacred, Dave yelled. The other two men picked me up and carried me over to a wooden platform. They lifted me up and placed me on the back of the platform and walked away to the stairs at the front of the platform. At that moment I had a thought to run away, but then I remembered that I was bound and gagged. I tried to reassure myself that this was just part of the ritual, the end to long arduous journey for acceptance. The platform was situated in front of a lake. I figured it was Old Hickory Lake, but I didn't recognize the area. At the edge of the platform was a metal box, the size of a coffin, attached to a red monorail that ran from the platform into the water. The red line under the water swayed with the current. Not affixed to anything solid, there was a hoist at the top of the monorail and a chain that ran parallel to it with intermediate sprockets at precise distances. The sprockets were engraved with the signs of the zodiac. Dave unfastened some clasps and opened the lid. Get him in there quick. We've already taken too long. All three of the men picked me up and attempted to toss me into the box. I wriggled, squirmed, and kicked until I landed my heel on Dave's chin. He dropped my ankles, massaging and moving his lower jaw. There was scowl on his face as he pulled a knife out of his back pocket. He slowly pulled the blade out and then sliced me across the shin. When he did, he pushed in hard as he slashed, making sure the blade cut deep and wide. Blood drained out down around my ankle as the wound splayed open even wider. Do that again and it'll be you, neck. They put me in the box without the least bit of resistance. Dave grabbed some wires attached to the inside of the lid. He peeled paper free from 2 electrodes and stuck them on either side of my chest. My elbow no longer hurt because of the excruciating pain in my shin. Dave took his knife and cut the bandana free from my mouth. I don't want to be a member anymore. Let me go home, I pleaded. Too late, buddy. Good luck. He closed the lid and secured it. I heard a motor start and a clink of the chain. There was a jolt and then movement. In front of me was a window so I could watch myself being submerged. The water climbed up the window and then over the top. I was under and descending deeper. The box slowly stood upright as the monorail went from an angle to a straight line. The light from the surface grew fainter as I descended. The air was thin and hot, my lungs constricted, my body covered in sweat and blood. The box bounced and came to an abrupt stop. The bottom was stirred, and mud floated up in front of the window. I could hardly breathe, so I wasn't keenly focused on what was going on outside of the box. But as soon as the debris cleared, a pale white face appeared in the window. Her cheeks were sunken in, and her lips were missing, torn or possibly never there to begin with, exposing her crooked, rotten teeth. Her stringy black hair flowed upward and into the current. The most alarming aspect, though, was that in her empty eye sockets were 2 flickering candle flames. She examined me from head to foot, her head moving eerily up and down, side to side. She reached over to the side of the box, and I heard a squeaking sound and then a gush of water. She had opened a valve. I moved over and pushed my hip against the hole to try and stop the flow. I heard a muffled growl from the woman, and she violently shook the box. I heard the clasps being unfastened. I moved back away from the hole and stood perfectly erect. I looked forward straight into her eyes, never moving from her gaze. I began to recite the incantation of reconciliation. I steadied my breath and concentrated on what Dave had taught. The woman flashed a constrained grin. Being that joy is difficult to express without lips. It was a subtle sign that she was pleased. The water was up to my chest, and I hadn't faltered, but fear got the best of me, and I started to weep. The woman expressed her anger again. The box shook, and the clasps were shimmied. I gathered myself and started the incantation. I wasn't calm. That would be a lie. But I did find a repose in the words of the incantation. I sharply focused on its meaning, even down to the syllables. I was looking at the woman but not seeing her. My mind was occupied. I purposely kept it occupied so that the perception of my death would lay buried in the subconscious. I had accepted my immediate demise. The cold water cooled the interior of the box, offering a torturing bit of relief for a moment. But only for a moment. The water seeped into my nostrils. I choked outward, only to swallow a large amount of water. I couldn't choke. I couldn't breathe. My stomach and lungs were bloated with water. My chest burned, and every muscle in my body tightened. The entirety of my body in an agonizing strain. I kicked and trembled, my heart beating faster and faster, a sharpness of immense pain radiating out from my chest. The mind began to race, hardly perceptive beyond panic and survival. My eyes were burning, but to my astonishment, I had a final vision before the end. The floating corpse of a monster was now a young, beautiful woman, happy and smiling, perfectly content with watching me die. The next thing I remember is waking up in a hospital bed, my eyes groggy. I could see a blurry silhouette of a man bending over me. "You did good, my boy. You died with courage. She accepts you." It was Nolan. "What happened?" "Shh, get some rest. We'll talk in the morning." The next morning, I woke up in a lavish bed with an ornate iron canopy decorated with mermaids and stars, and a bright red fabric with gold fringes draped over the top. I got up and made my way to the door. There, in the next room, was a room full of hooded elders, sitting on a dais with an altar in front. On the altar was a scarlet robe. Every one of the elders had their hoods pulled up, except for Dave. He looked sullen and depressed, never lifting his eyes to look at me. I had no words. I wondered how I got to this place. 1 minute in a hospital, the next in a mansion. Charles stood up and spoke. "You are now one of us. Take this scarlet robe and wear it with pride." I went to the altar and pulled the robe off and held it out in front of me. It was without a hood, the mark of a member, but not yet an elder. I put it on with a little hesitancy, but also with a little pride. I felt I had earned it, but questioned what I had gotten myself into. The ceremony dragged on for over an hour, and then there were congratulations. Cigars and alcohol, plenty of alcohol. Everyone was jovial and far beyond sober, yet Dave never moved from his chair, never partook of any of the festivities. I was curious. I found Nolan tucked away in a corner, semi-conscious, but happy to see me. "I knew you'd succeed." "Thanks, but I'm not sure I understand all this nor want it." "You don't have a choice. None of us do." I knew that to be the truth. He didn't have to voice the obvious. The fact that they had killed me and shown me something both horrifying and mystifying meant that I could never leave of my own volition. "What's wrong with Dave? Is he pissed at me?" I asked. "No, he's scared. When one comes out, the other goes in." "What's that mean?" "She liked you, so she let you go. That means we owe her," he explained. I gave him a confused look. It's Dave's turn to take a ride to the bottom of the sea to have a little meeting with the fair old lady. He was the master of ceremony, his chance to be an elder. "But guess what?" he said with a drunken grin on his face. "If she likes the novice, then the master of ceremony has to take his place, and there isn't any coming back like you did." "What happens?" I asked. "She eats him." Thank you for venturing into the darkness with us. If you dare to explore further, be sure to subscribe to our channel for more spine-tingling tales of horror and the supernatural. Remember, the shadows hold endless mysteries, waiting to be unveiled. Stay tuned for more bone-chilling stories as we continue to traverse the eerie depths of the unknown together. Until next time, may your dreams be free from the haunting echoes of our tales. Or perhaps not.